Pick any wife for free, the judge laughed, his voice echoing through the courthouse like a whip crack. The crowd roared, some jeering, some shuffling nervously. But then the cowboy's hand rose, not to the polished women in silk, not to the pale-faced ladies lined like cattle, but to the black girl in chains at the back of the room. Silence fell. Shackles clinked as her head lifted, her eyes wide with disbelief. What happened next would shake the town to its foundation. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I'll know how far this story has traveled. The courthouse smelled of dust, sweat, and stale tobacco. Every board creaked as though the building itself disapproved of the spectacle inside. Judge Pike lounged behind his desk, a man thick through the waist but quick in cruelty, his black robe draped more like a costume than a garment of justice. His gavel, chipped at the edge, rested in his hand, not as a symbol of order, but of ownership. In front of him, the so-called marriage market unfolded. Women, some trembling, some stony-eyed, stood in lines like auction stock. Their dresses were mismatched, some threadbare, others gaudy, with borrowed lace. Each bore the weight of Pike's decree. Anyone too poor to pay debts or fines could be given as a wife, claimed by whomever the judge permitted. The men in the room, miners, ranch hands, traders, shuffled and muttered, their eyes crawling over the women. Some faces held hunger, others guilt, but none dared defy the ritual. At the far end of the room, separate, half hidden by shadow, sat 3 figures in iron chains. These were not dressed up to disguise their condition. They were black. 2 men and a young woman, and the iron cuffs clamped around their wrists and ankles spoke plainly. For them, there was no illusion of choice. The young woman's name was Sila. Her head hung low, a tumble of dark curls hiding her face. Her wrists ached where the shackles bit into them, but the greater pain lay in her chest, the memory of her mother's voice telling her once that dignity could never be stripped by chains. Tonight she struggled to believe it. Judge Pike leaned forward, his lips curling. "Gentlemen," he drawled, "tonight is a night of fortune. You've worked hard, spilled sweat on this land. And as reward," he spread his arms like some mock preacher, "you may take yourselves wives, free." The word cracked the air. A ripple of laughter followed. "Pick any wife you like," Pike continued, "and let us see who claims his fortune." The crowd pressed closer, the wooden floor groaning under their boots. It was then that Gideon Hayes stepped forward. He was not a young man, but neither was he old. A rancher hardened by the plains, tall in the shoulders, lean in the jaw, his eyes carried the stillness of one who had weathered storms others could not. His coat was worn dust clinging to the seams. He removed his hat, not in deference to Pike, but to let the room see his face plain and unflinching. "I'll pick," Gideon said, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the noise. All heads turned. Pike's grin widened. "Well, well. Hayes, thought you'd sworn off the marriage market." "I'm not here for the market," Gideon replied, his gaze sweeping past the women in silks and patched cotton. His eyes found Sila bound in iron. For a moment, silence coiled tighter than any chain. Then he lifted his hand and pointed. "I'll take her." Gasps erupted. A tankard clattered to the floor. Someone cursed under their breath. The girl in chains lifted her head, eyes wide, breath caught. Pike's grin faltered. His hand tightened on the gavel. "The slave." "She's not a slave," Gideon answered evenly. "She's a woman." The words landed heavy, shocking in their simplicity. Sila's chest heaved as if she'd been struck. The crowd erupted into jeers, some laughing, others spitting. "Madness," one man shouted. "He's gone soft in the head," another sneered. Pike slammed the gavel, its sharp crack slicing the uproar. "Hayes, you test my patience. The offer was wives, free wives. Not charity cases. That girl is property of this court until her fines are settled." Gideon stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the boards. His voice did not rise, but it carried. "Then count my claim as payment. I'll settle her fines, whatever they are." Sila's breath caught. She searched his face, trying to understand if this was mockery, pity, or something she had never dared hope for. Pike leaned back, eyes narrowing. His tone was oily mocking. "You'd waste coin and name on her. Look around you, Hayes. Fair-skinned ladies, young untouched, ripe for a man of your station, and you point to chains." Gideon's jaw clenched. "I point to freedom." The crowd fell silent again, unease prickling the air. Pike's laughter returned, forced this time, ugly. So be it. If you want her, you'll have her. But mark me, Hayes, when she drags you down, don't come crawling back to this court. He motioned to the deputies. Keys rattled, chains fell heavy. Selah staggered as her wrists were freed, the iron leaving angry red rings in her skin. She swayed, nearly collapsing, until Gideon caught her arm. The touch jolted her. She looked up into his face. His eyes, steady and unflinching, held no mockery. The hall buzzed with whispers, some laughed, others muttered darkly. In that moment, Selah understood the man had done something reckless, something dangerous. And for reasons she could not grasp, he had done it for her. Outside, the night wind howled against the windows. The story that would burn this town's history into two halves before and after had just begun. The door slammed behind them, shutting out the courthouse noise, but not its echoes. Selah's wrists still tingled where the shackles had bitten, the memory of iron burned into her flesh. She stumbled into this cold night air, the wind cutting through her threadbare dress. For the first time in months, the sky above stretched wide and unbroken, but freedom felt heavier than chains. Gideon released her arm slowly, as though testing if she could stand on her own. She swayed but steadied, drawing a sharp breath into her lungs. He studied her a moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a length of cloth. Here, he said, wrap this round your shoulders. She hesitated. No man had handed her anything that wasn't an order or a burden. His voice carried no command, only a plain offer. She took it, the fabric rough but warm against her skin. From the courthouse window, muffled laughter spilled into the street. Shadows moved behind the glass men, jeering women, whispering Judge Pike's booming voice like a drumbeat of disdain. Gideon ignored it all, motioning her toward the hitching post where his horse waited. The animal snorted, stamping its hooves against the frost-dusted ground. A sturdy bay gelding muscles rippling under the lantern light, it watched Selah with the same calm intensity as its master. She halted. Where are you taking me?" Her voice was hoarse, thin from silence and chains. Gideon adjusted the reins. "Away from here." Her eyes narrowed. "That's no answer." He looked at her, then his gaze steady. "To my ranch. Safer than Pike's cell. You'll have food, a bedwork if you want it. But no chains." The word struck her heart like a hammer. "No chains," she whispered, tasting the possibility. It frightened her more than the shackles had. Before she could question further, footsteps echoed from the courthouse steps. Deputy Calder emerged, his lantern swinging, his face flushed from drink. "Hayes." He barked the night air, turning his breath to steam. "Judge says you're a fool, but a fool's money spends the same. You'd best pay her fine by week's end, or we'll haul her back." Selah stiffened, her hope cracking like thin ice. Gideon didn't flinch. "You'll have your coin," he said, calm as stone. Calder sneered, his eyes sliding over Selah. "Don't see why you'd waste it on her when Pike's got fairer stock." The words slithered through the air. Selah's chest tightened, the old shame threatening to drag her under. But Gideon's voice cut through hard and sharp. "Careful, Calder. You look a man in the eye when you talk not at his shadow." The deputy chuckled, but unease flickered in his stance. He spat into the dirt and turned back toward the courthouse. "Your funeral, Hayes." The door banged shut behind him. Silence fell, broken only by the horse's restless breath. Selah glanced at Gideon, expecting anger, maybe regret. Instead, he swung into the saddle with practiced ease, then extended a hand. "Come on." Her stomach nodded. To climb onto a horse beside him was to step into a world she no longer knew how to trust. But behind her, the courthouse loomed, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steadying as he pulled her up behind him. She settled onto the horse, her arms instinctively clutching his coat for balance. Heat radiated through the fabric, steady and grounding. They rode. Hooves struck the frozen dirt, the town falling away into darkness. The night spread wide around them, stars pricking holes in the black sky. Selah closed her eyes against the biting wind, every jolt of the saddle reminding her this was real. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Why me?" Gideon didn't answer right away. The rhythm of the horse filled the gap, a heartbeat against the earth. Finally, he said, "Because no one else would. And because a person ain't property. Not in my eyes. Her throat ached with unspilled tears. For months she had prayed for someone to see her as more than chains. Tonight a stranger had spoken it aloud in a room full of men who laughed at the thought. Yet doubt lingered like a shadow. Men's kindness had always come with a price. She leaned back slightly, measuring his tone, his steadiness. His words carried no hunger, no claim, just the blunt certainty of a man who had already made up his mind. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and dark. In the distance, a coyote cried its mournful howl, chasing the hoofbeats. Gideon guided the horse toward the horizon, his shoulders square against the wind. Behind him, Sela clutched the borrowed cloth tighter, fear and hope warring inside her chest. She did not yet know if he had saved her or doomed them both. The ride stretched long into the night, the horse's steady gait eating up the miles while the wind cut sharp against their faces. Sela clung to the cloth Gideon had given her, its coarse fibers scratching her skin, but she held it tighter as if it were a shield against the unknown. Each hoofbeat echoed like a drum, carrying her farther from the courthouse, farther from chains, yet toward what she could not say. The land unrolled around them, dark plains rippling beneath the stars. The moon climbed higher, silvering the frost on the grass. Every now and then, Gideon slowed the horse, scanning the horizon with the wary instinct of a man who had learned not to trust quiet nights. Sela noticed the way his shoulders tensed when a branch snapped or a coyote howled. He was a man carved by vigilance. Finally, he drew the horse to a halt near a shallow creek, its water whispering over stones. He swung down, then offered his hand to her again. She hesitated, but the ground called to her legs, stiff from the ride. She slid down her feet unsteady on the frozen earth. Gideon tied the reins to a low branch, then crouched by the water, cupping a handful to drink. "Go on," he said. "It's clean here." Sela's lips were parched, but suspicion warred with need. She crouched on the opposite bank, watching the water glimmer under moonlight. Finally, she bent and drank the icy current burning her throat before soothing it. The taste of freedom was cold and sharp. When she sat back, Gideon was watching her. Not with hunger, not with pity, but with a quiet measure, as though memorizing who she was without chains. "What's your name?" he asked. The question startled her. So many months she had been girl property stock. Her name had been stripped from her lips until it felt dangerous to speak it. She swallowed hard. "Sela." He nodded once. Gideon Hayes. His name was plain, unadorned, like the man himself. She tucked it away, uncertain whether it was a gift or a warning. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the creek. At last Sela asked, "Why did you choose me?" "In there you could have had anyone. You risked their wrath." For what Gideon leaned back against a tree, his hat shadowing his face. "I've seen enough cattle markets to know what it looks like when people are treated worse than beasts. Couldn't stomach watching it happen again." "Not tonight." She stared at him, bewildered. "And you think just picking me changes that—" His gaze lifted steady on hers. "No, but it changes it for you." Her breath caught. For months she had begged heaven for a crack in the walls around her. Tonight a stranger had pried the bars loose with nothing more than stubborn words. Still her heart trembled with mistrust. "Men don't do things for free." A muscle twitched in Gideon's jaw. "I'm no man's saint, but I don't deal in chains." The fire in his tone unsettled her. It was not tenderness, but conviction. She drew the cloth tighter, wondering if conviction could be trusted any more than desire. They rested there for a time, the horse grazing quietly nearby. Gideon kept his eyes on the tree line, every sound sharpening his posture. Sela tried to draw warmth from the cloth, her body aching with exhaustion. Sleep hovered but would not settle her mind too alive with the question of what tomorrow would bring. At last Gideon pushed off the tree. "We've got miles yet. Come on!" Back in the saddle, the ride pressed on. The night grew colder, frost creeping across the ground in silver webs. Sela leaned into Gideon's back, not from trust, but from necessity, clinging against the sway of the horse. His steadiness anchored her, even as fear whispered that anchors could drown as well as save. By dawn, the first faint streaks of light broke across the horizon. Hills rose ahead, rolling toward a patchwork of pastureland. Smoke drifted from a chimney in the distance, thin and gray against the pale sky. "That's mine," Gideon said, his voice low. Sela followed his gaze. A modest ranch spread across the plain, the house plain but sturdy, its roof patched but holding. A corral stretched beside it, fencing in a handful of cattle. The land looked worn, but it was alive, shaped by hands that worked instead of whipped. Her chest tightened. This place could mean safety or a new prison with gentler walls. They rode through the gate, the horse snorting, as if glad to be home. Gideon swung down, then helped her dismount. Her knees buckled on the packed earth, but she steadied, lifting her chin. She would not crumble now, not when the ground was firm beneath her. From the house, a door creaked open. A boy of about 12 emerged, lanky and sun-browned, his hair sticking up like wheat stalks. His eyes widened at the sight of Selah darting from her face to her ragged dress. "Pa?" he asked, confusion thick in his voice. "This is Selah," Gideon said simply. "She'll be staying here." The boy blinked. His gaze lingered on the marks around her wrists, then flicked to his father. Questions brimmed, but none dared spill. Selah stood frozen, the weight of the boy's stare pressing down. For the first time she realized her fate now entwined with not just Gideon, but whoever lived under his roof. And though chains no longer bound her wrists, the invisible ones of uncertainty tightened around her heart. Her count 356. The boy lingered at the doorway, his bare feet planted on the wooden stoop, staring at Selah as though she had ridden in from another world. Selah shifted under his gaze, tugging the cloth tighter around her shoulders. She wanted to speak, to offer something that would soften the shock in his eyes, but her throat clenched shut. Eli Gideon said at last, his voice even, "Tend the horses. We've ridden far." The boy blinked, startled from his stillness, then nodded. "Yes, Pa." He jogged toward the corral, though his head kept turning back toward Selah. Curiosity and unease etched into his young face. Selah remained where she stood, her feet rooted to the earth. The ranch sprawled around her, a patch of rough survival carved into the plains. The house was modest, its boards weathered gray. A lean-to shed slumped against one side, tools scattered about. The smell of smoke and cattle drifted on the breeze. This was no mansion, no promise of luxury. It was grit and toil soil, turned by calloused hands. "Come on," Gideon said, motioning her toward the door. She followed him into the house, her steps tentative. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and strong coffee. The single room was spare table chairs, a stove shelves lined with jars of dried beans and corn. A narrow hallway led to what she guessed were sleeping quarters. It was no prison cell, but its plainness felt foreign. Gideon set his hat on the table, then turned to her. "You'll need rest. And food." Her stomach tightened at the word, but hunger was an old companion, one she had learned not to trust. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not." His tone left no space for debate. He moved to the stove, stoking the coals until flames licked higher. From a pot, he ladled stew into a tin bowl and set it on the table. The scent of meat and onions wafted up sharp and tempting. Selah's knees trembled. She had eaten little more than scraps for weeks, and the sight of real food nearly unraveled her. Her fingers hovered over the bowl. She expected a command: eat quickly, don't spill, finish every bite. But Gideon only nodded toward the chair. "Sit." She lowered herself slowly, the wood creaking under her. She lifted the spoon with shaking hands, the metal clinking against the bowl. The first bite scalded her tongue, but she swallowed it anyway, the warmth flooding her body. Tears blurred her vision. She blinked hard, unwilling to let them fall. Across the table, Gideon busied himself with removing his coat and setting a kettle on the stove. He did not watch her, did not measure her portions. It was a small mercy, and it unsettled her as much as it comforted. The door creaked open, and Eli returned, his boots thudding across the floor. He paused at the sight of Selah at the table, then looked to his father. "Pa, who is she really?" Selah froze the spoon halfway to her mouth. Gideon's gaze met his son's. "She's someone who needed a place. That's all you need to know for now." Eli frowned, chewing his lip. "Folks in town'll talk." "Let 'em," Gideon said flatly. The boy studied Selah again, his eyes narrowing as though trying to see what his father saw. Then he sighed and slumped into a chair, his young shoulders carrying a weight older than his years. Selah lowered her gaze to the bowl. She had known this moment would come, the suspicion, the whispers. No freedom came without its chains of rumor. After a while, Gideon stood. Eli bed down. "It's late." The boy hesitated, then shuffled off toward the hallway. His footsteps faded, leaving the crackle of the fire and the steady beat of Sela's heart in her ears. Gideon leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You'll stay here. No one's taking you back to Pike." The name twisted her stomach. "He'll come," she whispered. "Men like him don't let go." Gideon's eyes hardened. "Then he'll find I don't scare easy." Something in his tone, calm, certain, sent a shiver through her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the walls of this ranch could hold back Pike's reach. But chains had a way of following even when broken. She set the spoon down, her appetite drowned in fear. "What if he sends men?" "Then I'll deal with them," Gideon said. He pushed away from the wall and stepped closer, his shadow falling across the table. "Sela, you're safe here. That's the only promise I'll make, and I'll keep it." Her chest tightened, torn between doubt and the dangerous hope his words stirred. Safe. It was a word she had not dared to believe in years. That night Gideon showed her to a small room off the hall, its bed narrow but clean blankets folded neatly. She stood in the doorway, unsure if she deserved such a place. "It's yours now," Gideon said simply. When he left her alone, Sela sat on the edge of the bed, fingers clutching the blanket. The walls did not close in. The door was not locked. Yet she felt the weight of invisible chains pressing down. Freedom was a fragile thing, and she feared waking to find it gone. As dawn bled into the sky the next morning, Sela rose from the bed. She stepped outside, the frost crunching beneath her bare feet. The prairie stretched wide and wild, the horizon unbroken. She breathed deep, the cold air burning her lungs. For the first time in months, she was outside without shackles. The sky above her was vast, and the sun's light touched her skin without judgment. Yet in the distance, far beyond the ranch, smoke curled from the town. Judge Pike still ruled there, his gavel like a whip, his laugh like a chain. And Sela knew her story with Gideon Hayes had only just begun. The morning light spilled across the plains, soft and gold, brushing the frost into glittering lace. Sela stood near the fence line, the hem of the dress Gideon had given her brushing her ankles, her hands tucked deep in the borrowed shawl. The cold pinched her cheeks, but she refused to step back inside. The wide sky pulled her outward, away from walls and ceilings, away from memories of stone chambers that reeked of damp and despair. Eli was already in the yard, hauling buckets of water with a grunt that seemed too heavy for his narrow shoulders. His hair stuck up at wild angles, his breath puffing white in the chill. He paused when he caught sight of her, his brows knitting together. "You ain't used to work, are you?" he asked, setting the bucket down with a thud. Sela stiffened. The question cut sharp, not cruel, but edged with skepticism. She drew her chin up. "I know work. Harder than you could imagine." He blinked as though her voice held truths beyond his boyish reckoning. Still, he muttered, "We all work here. Pa says land don't feed those who just watch." She bit back her retort, pressing her lips together. Eli was no enemy, only a boy raised in the image of survival. Still, his words pricked at the scars Pike had left, scars of being seen as idle, as worthless, as less than human. Gideon emerged from the barn, then his broad shoulders filling the doorway, a bridle looped over his arm. "Eli," he called, "finish up with the cattle, then split kindling for the stove." The boy nodded and trudged off the bucket, sloshing at his side. Gideon turned his gaze to Sela. "You'll freeze standing there." She glanced back toward the house, but did not move. "I just wanted to feel it, the air, the sky." Her voice cracked, unguarded. "It doesn't smell like chains out here." Something flickered in Gideon's eyes, a shadow of recognition. He stepped closer, his boots crunching frost. "Then take all the sky you need. Nobody's cutting it off from you here." The words warmed her more than the shawl. Yet doubt clung stubbornly. Safety was a promise she had heard before, always broken, always poisoned. Gideon studied her a moment longer, then jerked his chin toward the barn. "If you want to help, come on. Work will keep the cold out." Sela hesitated. A voice deep inside whispered that this was a test, not of chains, but of belonging. She followed him into the barn, the air thick with hay and the musky scent of horses. Dust swirled in the beams of sunlight cutting through the slats. Gideon handed her a brush, motioning toward a chestnut mare. Gentle strokes with the grain. "Talk to her. Horses listen better than most folks." Her hand trembled as she approached the animal. The mare flicked her ears, nostrils flaring. Sela raised the brush, tentatively dragging it down the horse's flank. The coarse hair prickled under her palm. "Easy now," Gideon said, his voice low. Sela murmured softly, words tumbling out unbidden fragments of lullabies her mother once sang. The mare huffed, her muscles loosening under Sela's touch. For the first time since stepping onto Gideon's land, Sela felt something ease inside her too. Hours passed in steady rhythm, the scrape of the brush, the shuffle of hay, the occasional low whicker from the animals. Sela's muscles ached, but the pain was honest, born of labor rather than punishment. She could live with pain like this. At midday, they gathered around the table. Eli shoveled food into his mouth, still stealing glances at her as though trying to piece together her puzzle. Gideon ate in silence, but Sela noticed the way his eyes softened when Eli grumbled about chores or when she flinched at a sudden noise. Afterward, Gideon leaned back in his chair. "Town will be talking already. Judge Pike won't take kindly to being crossed." Sela's spoon froze halfway to her lips. "He won't forget," she whispered. "No," Gideon agreed. "But forgetting ain't the same as winning. He'll send word, maybe men." "We'll be ready." Eli's eyes widened. "You mean trouble's coming here?" Gideon's gaze stayed steady. "Could be. But this ranch has weathered storms before. We'll stand." Sela lowered her eyes, fear tightening around her ribs. Every kindness she tasted here was threatened by Pike's shadow. She had been plucked from chains, but the gavel still echoed like a whip. That evening she stepped outside again. The prairie stretched endless, the sky painted in fire and ash as the sun sank low. The air carried a stillness that made her shiver. She thought of Pike's laughter, the sound of iron locks. He would not let her slip away so easily. A door creaked behind her. Gideon stepped onto the porch, pipe in hand, the smoke curling upward. He did not speak for a long time. Then softly he said, "Freedom don't come cheap, Sela, but it's worth fighting for." Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask why he was fighting for her, a woman he had plucked from a line of chains. But the question lodged in her chest. Perhaps the answer would terrify her more than the silence. In the distance, a coyote howled lonely and sharp. Sela lifted her face to the darkening sky, whispering a prayer her mother once taught her, words of hope fragile as breath. Inside the house, a lantern flared in the window, casting a warm glow on the cold ground. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder if light might truly belong to her again. But even as warmth settled in her chest, a darker thought pressed close. Pike's men could already be on their way. And if they came, freedom would be tested not by promises, but by fire and blood. By the next morning, the sky had turned a pale iron blue, the kind of winter light that makes breath look like smoke, and every sound carry farther than it should. Sela ladled coffee into tin cups while Gideon laced his boots with the deliberate motions of a man who'd learned never to rush the day. Eli wolfed down his porridge with a boy's impatience, glancing between them as if waiting for a signal that would tell him how worried to be. The signal came from the road. Hoofbeats thudded along the frozen ruts, then slowed at the gate. Gideon's chair scraped back. He stepped to the porch, and Sela followed the steam of her cup ghosting up past her cheek. A freckled carrier boy from town, Benson, barely 16 and already hard-eyed, sat astride a pony with a leather pouch slung against his hip. Message, Benson said, voice too loud for the quiet. His gaze flicked over Sela and ricocheted away as if he might get scorched for looking too long. From the courthouse. Gideon held out his hand. The boy passed the folded notice stamped with Pike's seal, a flourish the judge favored, as if ink could make his words holy. Gideon read, jaw setting. Sela watched the muscles notch along his cheek. "What does it say?" Eli asked, half a whisper, half a dare. Gideon refolded the paper with calm that wasn't calm at all. "Judge Pike acknowledges receipt of intent to settle fines," he recited flatly. "He requires the balance by week's end. If not, the court asserts its claim." Benson shifted in the saddle, trying on a grin that didn't fit. "He also said to tell you he hopes you're enjoying married life, Hayes. Says you sure do have a taste for trouble." Gideon's eyes lifted slow, the look that made smarter men back up a step. "You done your work, Benson? Go on." The boy swallowed, sent a last quick glance at Sela. Curiosity, pity, fear tangled together, then wheeled the pony and rode off, kicking up brittle clods of frost. Eli let out a breath he'd been holding. "We got the money, Pa." "We'll have it," Gideon said. Selah heard what he didn't say. She tucked the notice into the inner pocket of her shawl and went back inside before they could see the heat in her face. She had learned in rooms filled with men like Pike that anger was a fire you carried hidden. You let it warm your resolve, not your tongue. By noon, the weather turned meaner, a thin wind whipping dust off the hard ground. Work pressed in from every direction. Gideon checked the east fence. Eli stacked wood badly and had to unstack it to do it right. Selah scoured the hearth and swept grit into a neat, accusing line that said, "This house will not be ruled by the dirt of other men." Another wagon rattled up mid-afternoon, this one, with a woman's posture at the reins and a stubborn tilt to her bonnet. Martha Calloway. Her widow's black had faded to a practical brown that matched the dust, but she wore it with a dignity that made the color feel chosen, not inherited. A stack of law books rode shotgun beside her, their leather spines nicked and soft with use. Gideon met her at the gate with a handshake that said, "Respect without saying the word." Martha's eyes, sharp as wire, took in the ranch in one sweep. The tools leaned wrong, the patched roof, the sleep heavy under Gideon's eyes, the quiet in Selah's shoulders. That wasn't submission, just coiled caution. "Mrs. Calloway," Gideon said. "Gideon," she answered, then turned to Selah with an inclination that felt like an introduction in a world where a woman like Selah didn't often get one. "Ma'am." Selah nodded. "Welcome." Martha passed a sack down flour, a twist of pepper, a small wrapped parcel that clinked like a tin of buttons. "You'll find Miller's shy of your coin this week," she said, glancing at Gideon. "Pike's been talking to them about the virtues of good citizens and the wages of rebellion." Gideon's mouth flat-lined. "We'll make do." "You will," Martha said, and her tone made do sound like win. Inside, she set her law books on the table. The room seemed to square its shoulders around them. Eli hovered, pretending to fix a crooked nail in the jam while he listened with both ears. "Judge Pike is sermonizing from the bench," Martha went on, loosening the ribbon at her throat. "Standing room only crowd yesterday. He called your choice an affront to the natural order, his words, and promised to restore decency with diligence. Folks ate it up the way starving people swallow sawdust when it's baked into a loaf." "Will they turn?" Gideon asked. "Some," Martha said. "Some already have. But others are tired of being told which way is up." Her look softened as it landed on Selah. "You've made more friends than you can see yet." Selah held the gaze a moment longer than safety allowed. "Friends are costly in Pike's Town." "So is fear," Martha replied. She drew a small ledger from beneath the books and flicked a thumb along its edge. "My late husband kept records. Not gossip facts. Transfers that didn't smell right. Fines that grew 3 sizes between the courtroom and the county chest. I can't promise what's in here will hang Pike, but I can promise it will leave a mark." Gideon's hand drifted, not quite touching the ledger. "Let's not be hasty." "Hasty will get you killed," Martha agreed. "Careful will keep you poor and angry. You'll need a third way, quiet and sharp." While the adults spoke, Eli rattled a drawer louder than necessary. "Mrs. Calloway," he blurted. "Boys at the store said Pa's took a witch wife." "That true, or they just mean she's different," Eli, Gideon warned. But Martha just tilted her head. "Boy folks call women witches when they're afraid of the names they earned honestly. Smart, brave, not beholden." She nodded toward Selah. "You'll learn that lesson or life will teach it to you rough." Eli flushed, unsure whether he'd been scolded or blessed. When Martha left, the ranch felt both heavier and steadier, like someone had nailed an extra brace under the joists. The light fell early. Supper was cornbread dry enough to be honest, and beans that surprised the tongue with pepper. Gideon's thanks was the kind that didn't use the word. After Eli bedded down, Selah tidied the table and paused at the ledger Martha had left just long enough for her pulse to thrum hard with wanting. Words had always been a door for her. She'd learned somewhere in another life how to turn the handle. But doors led to light and danger, both. She set the book aside, then drew a scrap of paper from beside the stove and wrote with the stub of a pencil, "Flour inventory pepper, coffee, low salt, good lamp oil, thin rope, frayed patience, stretching. Gideon returned from checking the barn snow crystals in his beard that melted when he stepped into the heat. He saw the list. His mouth twitched something like amusement in a man who didn't let himself keep much of that around. "You right," he observed. "I keep count," she said without apology. "Count's half the fight," he said. "The other half is not getting caught short by the part you didn't count on." As if summoned by his words, the knight answered with a complaint from the pasture, one sharp yelp and a scatter of hooves. Gideon's hand found the rifle by reflex. "Stay inside," he said, and was already out the door. Scylla wasn't much for orders, but some you obey because they're built with reason. She snuffed the lamp to a low glow and stood near the window, eyes straining. The cold bit his lungs in 2 strides. He reached the fence and spotted it by lamplight wire, sagging like a tired mouth, a post leaning at a wrong angle. Beyond 2 calves bobbed like guilty children just on the far side of right and wrong. He whistled low, the kind sound he used for spooked animals and stubborn men, and coaxed them back through. His breath made clouds. His temper wanted a target. He found one in the post. "Not rot," he muttered, crouching. The break was too clean, notched with a practiced swing, then eased back into place to fail under a cold night and no witness. He set the post straight and wired it hard enough to hold. Footprints ghosted along the fence line, a man in worn boots with a heel nick that left a crescent. The trail ran to the road and vanished where the hard pan swallowed Story's whole. Back in the house, Scylla had the lamp up a shade, her face lifted to him like a question. He answered by setting the rifle back in its place without comment. "Cut?" she asked. "Cut," he said. They did not say Pike's name. They didn't need to. The judge had found a way to be present in the places he was absent to lay a hand on a man's gait without touching it. Scylla felt the old dread slide cold fingers along her spine, then burn out into something cleaner. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll walk the fence line with Eli. 4 eyes see more than 2. Gideon shook his head first on habit. Then he looked at her, really looked, and the refusal softened. "Stay inside the line. If you see anyone, I'll come back," she said. "I won't be a hero." A small, strange smile touched his mouth. Heroes die. Workers outlast. They slept light and badly, as people do when the dark itself feels like an ear pressed to their walls. At first light, Scylla and Eli walked the perimeter. She taught him how to read the ground-disturbed dirt crust grass, bent the wrong way, the extra story told by a heel. Eli started to brag that he'd have found it all himself if she hadn't, then caught her look and turned brag into a nod. "You're good at this," he said. "I had to be," she answered. Because of always," she said, and let it stand. At the north corner, they found the well bucket hanging with a new hole punched near the seam, subtle and mean. Eli swore soft the way a boy does when he's trying on being a man. Scylla ran her thumb along the edge. Clean cut. A knife with a patient hand. "Don't tell Pa yet," Eli blurted, panic and pride mixing. "He'll think I left it wrong." "He'll think what's true," Scylla said. "And he'll fix what he can." They returned to the house with the bucket and their report. Gideon listened without interruption, then set the bucket on the table like a case exhibit. You could hang a man by the rope it took to do all this petty damage. He said not to frighten them, but because naming truth is its own form of defense. That afternoon, the general store refused Gideon's order for nails. Backlog. The clerk lied, eyes sliding. The smith returned his broken rasp still broken. "You understand," he muttered. A neighbor met Gideon's wave with a stare that held apology hostage behind fear. The world was tightening, one small turn, then another. Scylla went quiet the way a field goes quiet before lightning. She cooked a stew with less meat than the tongue wanted and more spice than the mouth expected. When Gideon and Eli sat, she served without ceremony. They ate like people who understood that food is a line you draw against a mean world. After Gideon pulled out his old ledger, he wrote with a carpenter's grip on the pencil. Fence post cut north. Grain bin light. Bucket hole. Store nails denied. Smith tool denied. Scylla stood beside him and said nothing. Then she slid a fresh sheet alongside and copied the list in a smaller hand with space for dates times who saw what. She added a line at the bottom, Witness S. Gideon studied the neatness, the order, the fight of it. You keep a fine book, he said. Books keep people, she said, eyes on the page. If you let them. He nodded once, like a man agreeing with the weather. Outside the wind changed. A crow set itself on the fence and watched the house as if it carried news. Night came down early, thick, and long. Before she banked the fire, Sela stood a moment at the door. She breathed in cold air and sent something out into it, a vow with no words, just bone and will. She would not be moved, not by whispers, not by a judge who mistook a gavel for God, not by the old fear that said, you are what they name you. Behind her, Gideon checked the latch and then checked it again. He'll come with more than cut posts next, he said. Sela's jaw set. Then we'll have more than patched fences waiting. And somewhere far off, a pair of hooves beat a slow measuring rhythm along the road, the kind of sound a man makes when he wants you to know the test has begun. The wind shifted at daybreak and scoured the plain clean, a razor-cold breath that made the cottonwoods clack their bare fingers together. Gideon walked the fence with a coil of wire slung across his shoulder boots, crunching through a crust of overnight frost. Eli trailed 10 paces behind, swinging a hammer he was still learning to carry like a tool instead of a toy. Sela came last, shawl pinned tight, eyes on the ground instead of the horizon. Not because she feared the horizon, but because the earth told truer stories. Prince Eli said, crouching at a scuffed patch where the grass bent north instead of east. Sela knelt beside him. Not fresh, she murmured. Night before last. Heel nick, same as the line by the north post. She traced the shallow crescent in the dirt, the mark she'd started to recognize like a bad signature. He walks toe-heavy to hide his weight. Fails at it. Gideon glanced back, one brow lifted. Proud wouldn't have been the word on his face, he didn't reach for proud easily, but there was a steadier thing there, a kind of respect that warmed colder than winter light. Keep calling it, he said. They straightened the drooping wire and reset a post. When Gideon lifted the mallet, Sela set her palm to the wood to hold it true. The shock of the blow stung her hand, but she didn't flinch. She had known worse shocks. Eli hammered staples and tongue, peeking at the corner of his mouth with focus. By mid-morning, the work thawed their fingers and eased their silence. A hawk hung over the pasture, patient and mean. The world looked ordinary if you squinted the way a wound looks smaller under a clean bandage. Back at the house, Sela poured water from the well and stopped midstream. She set the bucket down, dipped 2 fingers in, rubbed them together. Slickness. Not from silt, too clean, too soapy. She brought her fingers to her nose and sniffed. The smell was faint ash, and something caustic. Gideon, she called, and he was there before the second syllable finished. She showed him her fingers. Someone salted the rope and washed the bucket with lye. Not enough to burn your mouth, enough to sicken a calf. He swore once softly, the way a man does when anger snaps a thread inside and he catches it before it pops. He took the bucket outside and upended it, water hissing into the dirt. They want me to waste a day blaming Eli, he said levelly, and then 2 more days fixing what got broke while we argued. He tossed the bucket in the woodpile. We'll boil every drop till I replace the rope. Sela marked the moment he never asked how she knew. He just believed her. It was a small thing, but to her it felt like someone had put a hand under her ribs to keep them from caving in. Around noon, a wagon creaked up the lane, the mule moving like it owed no one speed. A woman stood on the brake-split skirt, dusty, one hand steadying a bundled toddler at her hip. She looked the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes and doesn't budge for sleep. Mrs. Hayes, she called, though her gaze kept darting to Gideon. Sela stepped forward, the name crossing her face like a shadow. She wasn't a Hayes. Not yet. Not anything owned by a man's name. But the woman's voice held no judgment. Only need, and need was language, Sela spoke. Sela, she said gently, what do you need? The woman shifted the child. Fever. Doc says pay up front or wait our turn till spring. I got neither coin nor time. She bit her lip. They say you can help. They say which, too, Gideon muttered under his breath. Sela ignored the word because she'd learned that some slanders turn honest when you hold them to the light. Woman who knows woman who does. Inside she said, we'll cool him. On the table the boy burned hot and dry breath sawing. Sela loosened his shirt, mixed willow bark, and mint cooled her cloth in boiled water and laid it across his narrow chest. She talked while she worked, not the way a nurse coos, but the way a person speaks to a scared body, soft and sure. You'll rest now. Your mom's here. The heat will leave you in little pieces. It won't win. The child whimpered, then sighed, the fever's edge blunting. The mother's shoulders sagged with gratitude that looked like defeat turning into something else. How to pay you, she whispered. Bring eggs when you have them, Sela said. If you don't bring a story from town. Truth, not pikes. The woman nodded hard. Truth I can bring. She glanced at Gideon. Judge put your name in his mouth Sunday. Called you different like it was a disease. She swallowed. Said he aims to cure it. After she'd gone, Gideon stood a long while at the doorway, watching the road as if it might confess the steps it would let pass by noon. Every person who comes here paints a target bigger, he said. Sela folded the cloth and wrung it. A target is still a circle, she said. Sometimes it's also a ring. He looked over, caught the corner of her thinking. You have a mind for traps. For not falling into them, she answered. It's a different art. When the afternoon lengthened, Gideon hitched the wagon for Town Nail's rope oil. Sela reached for her shawl. I'm coming. He hesitated. The town would watch her like a carnival. He hated the thought of it, but he also knew better than to draw more lines around a woman who had just pulled a child back from a fever. Stay close, he said. Main Street wore the grin of men too curious to pretend otherwise. Heads swiveled as they rolled past the saloon. A card player at a window lifted his hat in a mock salute. 3 others laughed into their whiskers. The general store bell rang as they entered, sweet as a lie. Mr. Dunn stood behind the counter, polishing a scoop that was already polished. Afternoon, Gideon said. Hayes Dunn replied, eyes sliding to Sela and back. What can a law-abiding business do for you today? His tone made business and law cousins by marriage. Nails, rope, lamp oil, cash money. Dunn weighed the words like he might find a slur hiding in them. He turned and reached slowly for the nails. Short on rope, he said. Short on a lot these days. Short on courage, too, Sela asked mildly. A couple of men by the barrels chuckled until they saw Dunn's face. He pushed the nails forward, measured skimpy. Watch your mouth, he said. You got your man to do your talking. I've got my own mouth, Sela said, not raising her voice. And my own coin. She slid a small stack across. The coins made an honest sound on the wood. Dunn looked irritated to hear it. You bring us that egg money, miss. Whatever you are, he said, and I'll sell to you fair. Until then, maybe don't stir up charity cases. Folks say you're bringing fever up from the flats. I bring boiled water and willow bark, she said. That's what folks say when truth makes them feel small. Gideon lifted the nails rope that wasn't enough oil that would have to stretch and turned for the door before the conversation could rot any further. On the porch, a knot of boys stood shoulder to shoulder, elbows out. The littlest one blurted, Is she a witch? Then flinched like the word might bite him back. Gideon didn't slow. She's a woman, he said. That's miracle enough for a day. Back at the ranch, the wind had eased and left a listening quiet. Eli met them with the news that the West Coop's latch had come up on its own, and half the hens had decided to experience freedom until he and the dog convinced them to reconsider. Sela found the latch screws just unseated enough to fail. She reseated them with a dab of pitch, then hung a tiny bell on a leather strip, a whisper of sound if the door went wrong at night. They ate early. The stew had more water than meat, but Sela had coaxed flavor from the bones like a promise. Eli talked too loud to hide his worry, then went quiet all at once and fell asleep under the table with his head on his arms, the way he hadn't done since he was smaller. Gideon carried him to his bed like it was the most ordinary thing a man does and set him down with care that made Sela's throat tighten. When the lamps were turned down and the house breathed easier, Sela stepped onto the porch. The sky was clear enough to stab. Stars hung low, arrogant, and cold. Somewhere out beyond the fence, a horse shifted. A saddle. Leather creaked the smallest sounds, riding the dark like rumors. She moved to the barn, slow, silent, trusting her feet to find the boards that didn't complain. The hay smell welcomed her, a better kind of dry than most kinds of hunger. She paused at the door, stilled her breath, listened. A mouse scritched. A rope ticked softly against a beam. The mare blew a tired sigh. And then she smelled it. Not hay, not leather, not the clean oil Gideon favored. Kerosene thin sharp, the ghost of a match that hadn't been struck yet. Her eyes adjusted and found it a green glass bottle tucked behind a bale, a rag stuffed in its mouth, the cloth stained dark. A clumsy man's cleverness. A coward's reach. Sela eased the bottle free with both hands as if it were a live thing and carried it outside, setting it in the watering trough until the oil bled into rainbow shimmers across the skin of the water. Only then did she let herself breathe. She followed the faintest track around the barn, the imprint of a boot toe and that same crescent heel leading toward the road and vanishing where hooves had scuffed it into anonymity. By the gate she found another sign, a spent match ground into the dirt, harmless only because the wind had remembered to be on their side. Back inside, she woke Gideon with a hand on his shoulder and 3 words. They brought fire. He sat up too fast, then caught himself listening, learning what had already happened from the calm in her voice. On the porch, she showed him the trough, the slick, ugly sheen. He stared a long time at the rainbow, at the way beautiful lies float on water and say they aren't what they are. They're done cutting, he said. They're starting to burn, she answered. He looked at her then, the way men look at a horizon that can no longer be ignored. You were quiet, he said. Not as a critique. Noise would have given us witnesses, she said. Tonight we needed proof. They walked the barn together in a spiral outer walls, inner beams, floorboards where a spark might hide and bide its time. They pulled bales back from the door, widened the aisle, left a shovel against each stall. Gideon set 2 extra buckets under the leak where the roof let the rain teach gravity. Sela strung a second bell from the loft ladder, the smallest warning. When they'd done what could be done in one night, they stood a moment in the center floor, cool under their boots, breath ghosting the space between them. Pike will say we're clumsy, Gideon said. He'll call it accident and write the story neat. Sela's eyes were knife-bright in the low light. Then we'll write our own story, she said, on paper. On people. He nodded as if he could feel the ledger's weight without touching it. Tomorrow, he said, I'll ride to Jory's place. He owes me a favor. We'll get the rest of the rope and nails without touching Pike's store. And I'll boil water, she said, and make poultice and mark prints and hang more bells. And we'll keep the barn from burning, he said. She didn't answer aloud. Some vows you keep between bone and breath. Just as they turned for the house, a glow flared low on the horizon. Brief far, maybe a lantern turned too fast, maybe a house pitching a little of its warmth into the night. It winked out as quick as it came. The wind returned, carrying with it the far-off hateful laugh of a coyote or a man who thought he owned the dark. Sela shut the door and slid the latch. Gideon checked it once, then again. In the corner, the ledger weighted the pencil lying across it like a small, stubborn weapon. She sat open to a fresh page and wrote a line that felt like flint striking steel. Found incendiary barn green bottle kerosene rag. Removed to trough. Prince heel nick. Match at gate. No ignition. When she set the pencil down, her hand shook once and then steadied. The house creaked the ordinary way old houses do, as if settling back into themselves after company leaves. The night for the moment held. They would sleep in their boots. They would wake to more careful malice. They would answer it with wire, with water, with words that made a record no gavel could erase. The farm was learning how to be a fortress. And so at last was Sela. The frost was heavier at dawn, whitening the pasture like a warning written in silence. Gideon rose first, stoking the stove, careful not to let the poker clank against the iron. He poured water into the kettle, his motions deliberate, like every sound could be overheard by ears just beyond the door. Sela followed soon after shawl, pulled tight, hair plaited back. The first thing she did was step onto the porch and study the yard, her eyes narrowing. She was no longer a guest on this land. She had become its sentinel. Eli bounded out half awake, tugging at his boots, the boyish eagerness in him already tempered by nights that carried too much watchfulness. He grabbed a biscuit, shoved it in his mouth, and grinned through the crumbs. Ain't no fire, he said around the bite. We beat 'em. Sela's gaze softened at him, but didn't ease. Last night was a test. They wanted to know if we'd wake, if we'd smell smoke. They'll come again. Gideon ruffled Eli's hair, but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the horizon where a low smudge of dust bent toward town. "We ride today," he said. "Supplies and favors. Pike won't be our only well." Sela nodded. "I'll keep the ledger. Every mark they leave we'll answer with one of our own." Eli wrinkled his nose. What good's a book against men with fire? Gideon crouched until he was eye to eye with the boy. Because words last. Fire dies when it's out of breath. But what's written, what's true, outlives liars. He tapped Eli's chest. "You'll remember that." By mid-morning, Gideon saddled his bay mare. Sela walked out with him, holding a satchel. She pressed it into his hand, dried willow bark, a strip of cloth wound tight, a vial of her boiled water. "Not just for wounds," she said, "for proof. If they poison, you'll taste it first here. Keep the bottle." He looked at her for a long breath, his thumb brushing the edge of the satchel. "You're planning like you'll be left to fight alone." "I'm planning like they think I will be," she said evenly. He wanted to argue, but the logic of her words sat between them like stone. He mounted, gave her a look that said more than thank you, and rode toward the road. Eli ran beside until the dust swallowed the horse's tail. Sela turned to the house. Alone now, she listened. Stillness was a teacher. The hens clucked in the yard, but too fast anxious. The dog dozed with one ear cocked. She followed the noise to the west fence where she found a small bundle tied tight to the post, dried thistle feathers and bone twined with horsehair. A hex sign, crude but deliberate. She bent to it, the smell of blood faint but certain. Whoever left it wanted fear to do their work. She took the bundle in her hand, studied it without blinking, then tossed it into the fire pit. As the feathers blackened and the bone cracked, she whispered, "Your curses turn to ash, same as your courage." She wrote it down in the ledger, hex sign west fence destroyed, then underlined the words twice. Near noon, hoofbeats rattled the lane. Not Gideon, too many horses. Sela stepped to the porch shawl, drawn close, her posture steady. 3 riders appeared, the middle one in a bowler hat, tilted cocky reins loose, like he owned the road. Pike's men. She knew it before they spoke. "Afternoon, miss," the leader drawled. "We're just checking fences neighborly like. Heard there was trouble with fires. Thought we'd lend a hand." Sela's voice cut clean. "Fences hold, fires fail. No hand of yours was needed here." The man's grin widened, but it never touched his eyes. "Now see, that's cold hospitality. We're offering concern and you're offering spite." His gaze flicked over her. "Judge says it's unnatural a woman keepin' house with just a boy and a man too stubborn to bow. He says, unnatural things end bad." Her pulse hammered, but her face stayed still. Judge's words are smoke. They choke, but they don't feed. The second rider spat into the dirt, a deliberate stain near her boots. The third just watched, hands easy on the reins, but his stare was the kind men use to measure rope for a hanging. The leader tugged his brim. "We'll be riding by regular, keepin' watch. For your safety, of course." They turned their horses slow, making dust rise where no rain had been. Sela stood until the sound faded, then went inside and rode again. 3 riders, Pike's men, spoke threats in Judge's name, returned South Road. The pencil dented the paper with each word. When Gideon returned late afternoon, rope and nails in tow, Sela met him at the gate and told him all. His jaw flexed, but his eyes stayed calm. "Good," he said finally. "Now it's written. That makes it real." Eli listened, fists clenched. "Why don't we just fight 'em?" he burst out. "I'm tired of hidin' and writin'." Gideon knelt, took the boy's hands. "Because fighting's what they want. If we swing first, the judge says we're lawless. If we answer with proof, then the law is what looks lawless." His gaze went to Sela. "We'll fight Eli, but not the way they expect." That night, as lamps burned low, Gideon sharpened tools at the table. Sela read the ledger aloud in a quiet, steady rhythm. Each line was an anchor. Eli, half asleep on the floor, mumbled, "It sounds like scripture." Sela paused, then closed the book gently. "Maybe someday it will be," she whispered. And the house held its breath around her words, as if the walls themselves knew prophecy when they heard it. The day never truly warmed, but it did its best to pretend. A brittle sun climbed over the cottonwoods and lay pale gold across the fields, glinting off the trough where oil still floated in thin, mocking colors. Gideon drew fresh water from a boiled barrel and scrubbed the trough clean with sand. Sela watched the rainbow slick break and scatter each swirl a lie undone. Eli ran fence again, huffing like a colt straining for praise. When he reached the gate, he stopped and pointed. "Bell's crooked," he said. Sela adjusted the leather strip she'd hung the evening before testing its whisper. "Crooked bells tell truer time," she said, and the boy grinned, even though he didn't quite know why. By mid-morning, the road served them two sorts of visitors. First came Mrs. Fallon with a loaf wrapped in a towel so clean it made Sela want to wash the table again. The woman's smile was small and frightened, like she'd snuck kindness past a guard. For the boy, she said, already backing toward her wagon. And for the doctoring. Her eyes lifted to Sela's face, then flinched away. "Don't tell my husband. He says we should keep to proper folk till the judge makes things right." "Thank you," Sela said, meaning it and not promising silence. An hour later came the second set, two men with law on their tongues and dust on their boots. Not deputies, Pike wouldn't waste their uniforms, but the men wore his posture and his smirk. "Inspection," the broader one announced, sliding from his saddle without waiting to be invited. He touched the fence post like it was his family Bible. "Judge wants to ensure citizens maintain good order." Gideon stepped between the men and the yard. "Order's fine here. Is it?" The narrower man with a mole near his right eye squinted at the bell on the coop door. "Seems a foolish little jingler. Spooks hens. Judge says alarms are for guilty minds." "Judge says a lot." Gideon answered, "You ever say how to fix a busted well bucket? How to count grain when the bin grows holes?" Sela felt the men's eyes scrape over her. The broader one smiled all teeth. "He says a broken water bucket and a bad wife look the same. Both spill what they should keep." Eli sucked in a breath like he might launch himself headfirst into a fist. Sela touched his sleeve just enough to anchor him. Gideon didn't move. "You've done your inspection," he said quietly. "Time you inspected someone else." The men's laughter left a slick behind it. "We'll be back," the narrow one promised. "Nights are long this time of year." They rode off, leaving hoofprints like signatures. Sela watched dust settle in the afternoon light and wrote it down in the ledger, so-called inspection. Men threatened return by night, then cleaned the nib of the pencil with careful, angry strokes. Martha came near sunset, the wind pushing against her like God himself had leaned into her back. She crossed the yard with her bonnet in one hand and her husband's ledger in the other. "Church again?" Gideon asked, reading the weariness in her shoulders. "Bench." This time, Martha said, dropping her voice. Pike didn't use the pulpit, he used the gavel. Said a tribunal will be convened if fines remain unsettled. 3 weeks from today, called it a domestic evaluation. The town heard public beating and came early with their popcorn. Sela's mouth went dry. "He plans to judge a house he's been sawing the legs off of." "Exactly," Martha said. "You'll need more than a ledger to hold him off. You'll need witnesses, not just sick children and spooked hens, men he can't call hysterical, women who will risk their reputations to spit in his book." Gideon's jaw worked. "They'll put their names on paper to make targets of themselves." Martha met Sela's eyes. "They already are targets. Paper doesn't change the aim, only where the arrow lands." They ate quickly, as if food might outrun news. Eli tried to make a joke about tribunal sounding like a bad stew, then let it die on his tongue. After dishes, Martha tied her bonnet and laid a small length of iron on the table, no longer than a hand crooked at the end. "What's that?" Eli asked. "A fire hook," Martha said. "My husband kept it in the courthouse after Pike let a lamp fall, accidentally, during a hearing about taxes. Jericho Calloway wasn't much with a rifle, but he could pull a flaming beam like it were sin, and he the preacher." Gideon turned the hook in his hands, testing the weight. "Borrowed, not given," he said. "Given," Martha corrected. "I'm tired of lending salvation." She left before full dark. The wind flattened her skirt against her legs and tossed grit up like insults. Gideon walked to the gate with the fire hook over his shoulder, a silhouette that promised more than his words did. Night settled the way it had begun. Brittle, pretending calm. They banked the fire low, hung the bells on the doors, checked latches. Eli yawned wide and insisted he wasn't tired, then curled on his pallet with his boots still on, just in case. Gideon sat at the table, the ledger open, the fire hook on the bench within reach. Scylla moved through the house without wasted motion, dousing lamps to a thin ribbon of light, setting a bucket by each door. She paused at the window and pressed her palm to the cold glass. The night pressed back. Somewhere near midnight, a coyote laughed the wrong way. Then came a sound that doesn't belong to animals at all glass kissing wood, kerosene thinking about faith, a spark deciding which way to go when it is born. A dull whomp rolled through the yard. Heat flared sudden and ravenous. The barn's south wall snapped from black to living orange, and the bells on the coop chattered like teeth. Fire Eli shouted already, stumbling into his boots. Gideon was moving before the word finished, the hook in his right hand, the rifle ignored. Scylla snatched the ledger off the table and shoved it into the flour bin. Dry safe, then seized the nearest bucket and ran. Air turns different around fire, thin and greedy. The flames licked up the planks and climbed into the loft, a greedy child finding the cookies on the top shelf. The mare screamed a sound that cracked the dark in half. Gideon hit the barn door with his shoulder, and it gave the latch had already been lifted, and heat clawed at his beard and eyebrows like angry fingers. Eli Line Scylla yelled, "Well to trough to doorway, pass, don't toss." She didn't ask if he knew what she meant. She trusted a boy's body to learn if his mind dragged. Neighbors arrived like sparks caught the wind and grew feet. Lanterns bobbed on the road, shouts tangled in the smoke. Someone had seen the glow and run. Someone always sees even when they'll swear later they didn't. Scylla planted herself where wind would carry sparks away from the house and ordered the bucket line with a clarity that made men twice her size pause. "You there, soak the roof of the shed, you wet the ground along the pen, keep the path clear." She spoke to people the way she spoke to fever, firm. No lies. Inside the barn, Gideon vanished and reappeared in red light and smoke, hauling a calf by the halter, slapping at embers with his vest. The beam above him groaned the way old timber does right before it remembers gravity. He heard the sound, but not fast enough. The crosspiece dropped and blew him to his knees with a coughing of sparks. The hook flew from his hand and slid under the stall. Papa Eli lunged, and Scylla caught the boy by the back of his coat before he could run into the mouth of it. "Hold the line," she shouted at him, the only order she'd give louder than a plea. She gave the bucket to the next set of hands, grabbed another, and barreled for the door. A man tried to stop her, the same man who had called her witch at the store last week, and she slipped his grasp with a pivot learned in rooms where a wrong move cost blood. Inside the heat pressed her back, but she ducked low and saw Gideon pinned from the waist down, one knee twisted under him, one beam across his thigh. His eyes found hers through smoke. He didn't say don't. He didn't say go. He said her name inside a cough, Scylla, and it sounded like trust being spoken out loud. She slid beside him, wrapped the rag around her hand, and reached under the beam for the fire hook. The iron bit her palm, but she didn't loosen her grip. With the other hand, she pressed a wet cloth to Gideon's mouth, then set her feet and pulled. The beam didn't move. She shifted, angle, leaned her weight, found a fulcrum in a feed barrel, and felt something give. She pulled again, brutal and sure. Outside the bucket line hissed. Inside the barn breathed flame. The beam lifted by inches. "Push," she said, voice even. "On my word." Gideon planted his palms, found his feet under him with a groan, and shoved. The timber rolled free and thumped to the dirt. He staggered, and she drove her shoulder under his arm, bearing up more weight than her size promised she could. Neighbors spilled in and took him from her under orders she didn't deliver because she didn't need to. She went for the mare eye's burning voice low. "Easy," she crooned through her scorched throat. "Easy, girl." She cut the lead, slapped the horse's hip, and the animal bolted for the door with a sound like gratitude. When they reached the yard, the line worked with rhythm now, with fear turned into duty. Eli passed buckets with wild-eyed speed but steady hands. Martha's bonnet appeared at Scylla's elbow as if conjured by need. Her face set her mouth, mouthing prayers and instructions in equal measure. "Keep the roof wet. Pull the embers down away from the loft." "Wind's shifting," Scylla rasped. Hair singed to frizz near her temple. "Turn the line 2 steps north." She threw her arm in a wide arc, and the whole human chain crabbed left as if they had practiced it in church. The fire fought like men who don't know when to leave a room they've ruined. But buckets and grit and water won where bullets would have turned grief into a headline. Little by little, the blaze starved. The barn sagged and smoked, ugly and alive. The last flame on the south wall guttered, flared like it wanted a final word, then died. Silence comes after fire, the way shock comes after a slap. The line fell apart into coughing and spitting and someone laughing too loud. A woman began to cry in great gulping sobs, then covered her mouth like she'd confessed to something indecent. The mare stamped and tossed her head sound and furious and unburned. Gideon sat on an upturned water bucket chest, heaving hair singed to curl eyebrows half gone. His right leg was already swelling where the beam had kissed it mean. Scylla knelt in front of him with a basin and a strip of clean cloth. The backs of her hands were blistering open, but her touch on his skin was cool and exact. "You breathe slow," she said. "In through your nose, hold, out through your mouth." He did as he was told. She moved like she had practiced this rhythm when the world wasn't on fire, one part tending the wound, one part measuring the man. She splashed the water along his burned forearms and pressed linen into place, bound his knee with a tight figure 8 that would make any army man nod. Martha crouched beside them, eyes wide. You've done this before?" Scylla kept her gaze on the bandage. Once or twice. The same man who had tried to grab her shoulder in the doorway stood 5 paces off, hat in his hands. Shame like a third thing hunched between him and the ground. I said a word at the store," he muttered. "Shouldn't have said it." Scylla looked up at him. "Then not to forgive, not to confess, just to set the measure." "Then don't," she said. "Say a true one now." She tipped her chin toward the barn to the wet planks and the blackened beams. "Say you saw who we are." He swallowed and nodded, and that nod would be a story by morning, when the worst of the crowd had drifted back to their beds and the stars remembered their jobs. Scylla took the ledger from the flour bin and set it on the table. Her fingers left wet prints on the cover. She dried them open to a fresh page and wrote, "Fire set south wall, late hour." Witnesses M. Calloway, J. Treen, S. Harper, others. Found kerosene rags after an ash near wall. Beam fell, Gideon pinned, freed with hook. Livestock saved, barn standing damaged, wind from west, bucket line neighbors. She paused, then added, because some truths aren't legal, but they matter more. Fear returned, but not to stay. Gideon shifted on his bucket, a man-sized wince crossing his face and then leaving. "You did what had to be done," he said. His voice was low, raw at the edges. "We did," she corrected. He watched her a long moment study, wrapped in gratitude. "They'll talk about tonight. They were already talking," she said, capping the pencil. "Now they'll have to talk about the right things." Martha stood at the door bonnet, dangling by its ribbon, a small, feral satisfaction on her face. "Pike will hear before sunrise," she said. "He'll call it a stunt. He'll say you burned your own barn for sympathy." "Then he'll be calling half the county liars," Gideon answered, and reached for Scylla's burned hands with a careful gentleness that surprised them both. "Wrap these," he said. "Please." She let him. And when the cloth settled around her palms, snug and cool, the farm seemed to lift its head. The bells on the doors hung quiet. The trough reflected a clean moon. The air smelled of wet wood, and something else. Something like a vow kept under the worst kind of pressure. By dawn, smoke would write thin gray sentences into the sky. By noon, Pike's men would ask hard questions in soft voices. By evening, the story would split into 100 mouths, some kind, some cruel. But for the first time since the gavel fell in that foul court, Scylla felt the scale tip underfoot, not to mercy yet, but toward a balance that might be wrestled into place by hands that refused to let go. Morning smelled of ash. It drifted from the blackened planks of the barn and mixed with the sharp tang of wet earth, for the neighbors had left puddles and muddy prints where the bucket line had stood. The farm looked both wounded and alive, walls charred, but upright livestock, jittery but breathing. Scylla walked the yard slowly, hands wrapped in linen, her eyes measuring each corner of damage. She kept her chin high, even though the burns throbbed with every heartbeat. Eli followed close, carrying a broom far too big for him. He swept at the mud, solemn as a soldier. "We saved it," he murmured. "We didn't let it burn." "We did." Scylla agreed. Then softer, so only he would hear, "But fire comes back if men bring it in their pockets." Gideon sat on the porch bench, his injured leg stretched out stiff, his arms folded across his chest. His hair still smelled singed. Watching Sela pace the yard, he felt something tighten inside, not just fear for her, not just pride. Something knotted complicated, like knowing a storm would come again, but also that she would face it standing. By mid-morning, riders approached. Not friendly neighbors this time, but a delegation of Pike's men, 6 in all, broad-shouldered with rifles slung casual across their saddles. They dismounted with the casual arrogance of men who believed law and violence were two sides of the same badge. Judge wants words, their leader said, his boots crunching on the gravel. He had a scar down one cheek that looked like a crooked smile. Barn fire looked suspicious from town. Folks whisper, Judge says maybe you said it yourselves. Gideon's jaw locked. That barn stood for my father and his father. You think I'd light it for theatrics? The man shrugged, eyes sliding to Sela. Maybe not you, maybe her. His tone curled on the last word, heavy with the poison Pike spread in whispers. Sela didn't flinch. If you truly believed I set fire, you'd be carrying shackles, not rumors. The man barked a laugh. Sharp tongue, miss. Careful it don't cut you first. His gaze flicked to the bucket line still damp in the yard. Neighbors claim they saw strangers flee the fence line just before the blaze. Describe men wearing Pike's colors. He spat to the side, pretending nonchalance. Judge says neighbors are excitable. He'll sort truth in tribunal. Martha stepped forward from the porch shadow. She'd arrived early, bonnet already hanging loose, face pale but steady. You tell Judge Pike we'll bring names, written, signed, and not just excitable farmers, deacons, storekeepers, veterans, men his own age, women who won't bow. The scarred man turned slowly, measuring her boldness. That a threat? That's testimony, Martha said. Something passed in his expression, an unease quickly hidden. He gestured to his men and they swung back into their saddles. Tribunal stands 3 weeks. Don't wander far. He gave Sela one more long look like a hawk considering prey, then rode off. Silence stretched after hoofbeats faded. Eli's broom slipped from his fingers. They're scared, he whispered. I saw it in his eyes. Sela touched the boy's shoulder. Scared men bite hardest. Inside, Gideon shifted painfully, anger simmering. Pike's not waiting 3 weeks. Fire was his rehearsal. Next time he won't leave the house standing. That's why we prepare, Sela said. She pulled the ledger from the flour bin again, its pages still smelling faintly of smoke. She laid it open on the table, then began writing the morning's exchange. In steady script, men came 6. Scarred leader, threatened, tribunal in 3 weeks. Witnesses will sign. Her handwriting never wavered. By afternoon, neighbors trickled in cautious at first, then bolder. Mr. Treen the carpenter laid a plank across the barn's frame without being asked. The Harper brothers brought buckets of nails. Even the storekeeper's son, who had once refused to serve Sela, carried water with his eyes lowered. Martha moved among them like a conductor guiding encouraging binding shame into action. One man hung back until nearly dusk. He was older, beard gone, mostly white eyes, milky at the edges, but still sharp. He leaned on a cane, but his voice carried. Name's Alton Briggs, fought under Fremont in Missouri, saw worse fires set by worse men. I'll sign. He jabbed the cane toward Sela. You write it, I'll mark it with my hand. Sela inclined her head. Your mark will matter. As the day faded, a small crowd lingered. Some whispered fears of Pike's retaliation. Others asked what good words on paper could do against rifles. Sela stood on the porch, hands still wrapped, her voice steady. Paper makes memory when fire tries to erase it. Pike wants silence. Our voices together deny him that. She lifted the ledger. Every signature is a nail in his coffin of lies. The murmurs swelled. Some nodded, some shuffled. But enough stood straighter that hope showed itself fragile as a candle but burning. Night fell again heavy with the memory of smoke. They banked fires, carefully set the bells anew, posted Eli near the window with strict orders to wake at any sound. Gideon dozed restlessly, pain dragging his breath short. Sela wrote until her eyes blurred, documenting every plank laid, every name spoken, every tremor of courage. When she finally closed the ledger, she pressed her wrapped hands flat against the cover. It felt warm, as if words themselves gave heat back. She whispered, not a prayer, but a promise. 3 weeks. We'll make them hear. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying embers of the past into the dark. But this time, inside the farmhouse, the air smelled less of fear and more of resolve. The night after the fire carried a hush that was not peace, but a tightening coil. Gideon woke often, every creak of the floorboards pulling his hand toward the rifle by his chair. Salah stayed awake longer, her shawl wrapped against the chill pencil scratching in the ledger. Each word she wrote felt like hammering a stake into the ground. Here we stand, here we remember, here we refuse. By dawn, the farm was already stirring. Smoke from neighbors' chimneys marked solidarity, a quiet answer to Pike's threat. Selah stepped out into the yard, breath turning white in the air. She lifted her chin at the sight, a new fence post set straight where the old one had been charred, a plank hammered firm over the barn's broken siding. It was more than repair, it was defiance in timber. Eli darted around her with the eagerness only a child could still muster in such times. Mr. Treen says he'll bring more nails, and the Harpers said they'll stay the week if we feed 'em. His voice carried both pride and hunger for belonging. The boy was learning that survival could look like fellowship. Gideon came hobbling after his limp pronounced, but his eyes sharper than the ache. We'll take their help, he said, but we'll keep guard while they swing hammers. Pike won't miss the chance to turn kindness into a target. Selah nodded, then glanced toward the horizon. The judge's men had not returned yet, but she felt them watching all the same. A crow settled on the fence rail, its black feathers gleaming. She whispered, "Even birds are messengers." Eli frowned at her words, but said nothing. By mid-morning, more neighbors appeared, faces Selah hadn't expected. Widow Gray brought a sack of flour. Samuel Brandt, who had once refused her at church door, now came with rope and nails. Each offered small gifts, but each gift felt heavier than iron a shift in tide. Martha walked among them, her voice calm, her hand steadying the nervous. She glanced at Selah often. A silent message passing between women who had seen too much to be fooled by small mercies. They both knew these offerings carried risk. To stand beside Gideon and Selah meant inviting Pike's wrath. Yet here they were. At noon they gathered on the porch. Gideon's leg throbbed, but he stood tall. Selah opened the ledger pencil poised. "Your names," she said, "not whispers, not rumors, written so they cannot be erased." Silence held for a long breath. Then Alton Briggs, the veteran with the white beard, stepped forward. His cane thudded on the porch. "I'll sign first. Fought men who thought they owned the country, same as Pike, thinks he owns this land. Didn't bow then. Won't now." He scrawled his shaky mark across the page. Others followed Treen the Harpers, Widow Gray, Samuel Brandt. One by one, hands pressed against the paper. By the time the sun tipped west, the ledger carried 12 names. Not enough to overturn Pike in court, but enough to frighten him. As the gathering broke, Selah carried the book inside like it was holy. She placed it on the mantel higher than any Bible. "They'll try to burn it," she said quietly, "so we'll guard it like our own lives." That night they doubled the watch. Eli begged to sit awake with the men, but Gideon made him promise only to listen near the window. "Alert, not reckless," he said. The boy pouted, but his eyes gleamed with pride at being trusted at all. The moon rose pale and distant. The fields glowed faintly silver, beautiful, but sharp as glass. Around midnight, Selah stirred from half-sleep. Something in the wind shifted. She slipped from her bed shawl, pulled close, and walked softly to the porch. There, just beyond the fence line, shadows moved. 2 figures crouched low, carrying something long between them. Not fire this time. Tools. Shovels. Her breath caught. Pike's men come to dig under cover of dark. She woke Gideon with a whisper. His eyes opened sharp. "Stay here," he ordered, reaching for his rifle. But Selah caught his arm. Not alone. Together they slipped outside steps muffled by frost. The intruders had not seen them yet. Gideon raised his rifle, the barrel catching moonlight. "Drop it," he barked. The men froze, then straightened, slow hands still on their shovels. One laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Just tending earth," he drawled. "Judge says maybe there's graves hid here. Runaways. Thought we'd check." Selah's voice cut the dark. "You won't plant lies in our soil." The man sneered. "Judge don't need our word. He'll believe what's dug." Don't matter what we find. Gideon took a step forward, rifle steady. Get off my land. They hesitated, then backed away, muttering curses. The moon lit their retreat, their shadows long and bent. When they were gone, Gideon exhaled slow. Selah pressed a hand to her chest, heart racing. They'll dig somewhere else, she whispered. Plant bones claim them ours. Gideon lowered the rifle jaw tight. Then we'll be ready to uncover truth faster than they bury lies. They returned to the house. Selah wrote again in the ledger. 2 men, shovels, claiming graves, driven off. The words steadied her hand. Eli, wide-eyed at the window, whispered, They want to bury us. Selah turned to him, voice fierce but calm. And we want to live. That's the stronger want. The boy nodded, and something older than his years flickered in his gaze. He would not forget. By dawn, the farm smelled not of ash but of resolve. Hammers rang again, neighbors' voices carrying over fields. And above it all, the ledger waited on the mantel, a silent witness that grew heavier with every word. The morning after Pike's men tried to dig false graves, the farm was awake before the rooster crowed. Gideon's leg throbbed with each step, but he forced himself outside, leaning on a cane Eli had carved crudely from a branch. You don't look like a judge, he muttered at himself, jaw clenched, but you'll stand like one today. Selah was already at the fence-line shawl, tight eyes fixed on the horizon, as if expecting riders again. The frost had turned the fields white, brittle underfoot, yet the sky was painted with streaks of rose. She breathed it in, steadying herself. The night's fear hadn't broken her. It had sharpened her. By breakfast, neighbors began to return carrying tools and questions. We heard shovels in the dark, Mr. Treen said, wiping his calloused hands. Somebody's trying to salt the earth with lies. They won't find graves that aren't there, Martha replied sharply, standing at Selah's side. But they'll make them if they must. That's Pike's way. Brant leaned forward, face creased with worry. Then we've got to stop waiting for their moves. We bring the fight to him. A heavy silence followed. Gideon tapped his cane against the porch, each thud a warning. Fight reckless and we'll be martyrs. Fight measured and we'll be victors. His voice carried the iron of someone who had already buried too many. Selah stepped forward, lifting the ledger high enough for all to see. This book is heavier than rifles, she said. It carries your names, your words, your truth. Pike can burn barns, plant bones, twist courts, but he can't erase what's written here if we guard it. Eli piped up, almost breathless. Then let's hide it. Bury it where they'll never find it. Martha shook her head. No. Buried truth is as good as silence. It must be seen, heard, spoken aloud in front of his own men. The crowd murmured. The plan hung between fear and hope. Selah closed the ledger softly. Then we carry it to town before Pike carries lies to us. We don't wait 3 weeks. We call the people to gather. Her words struck like flint. A fire spread through those weary eyes. Widow Gray clutched her shawl tighter, but she nodded. Briggs, the old veteran, slammed his cane against the porch. Court or no court, truth belongs in daylight. I'll stand beside you. By mid-morning, a caravan began to form. Wagons pulled from sheds, horses saddled baskets filled with bread for the road. Gideon strapped his rifle across his back despite Martha's protest. You'll tear that leg apart, she warned. It's already torn, he answered. Better it than our souls. Eli hopped between wagons, his excitement mingling with fear. He carried a satchel too big for him, stuffed with scraps of paper he had begged from neighbors. They'll all sign, he said proudly. Every soul that knows the truth will mark it. Selah lifted the ledger and tucked it into her shawl as though wrapping a child. The weight pressed against her ribs, but she didn't bend under it. She looked at Gideon, then at Martha, then at the gathered crowd. We ride not as beggars for justice, she declared. We ride as witnesses. The wheels creaked forward. The caravan left the charred barn behind, rolling toward town like a quiet army of farmers, widows, children, and scarred men who had decided fear had stolen enough from them. As they neared the river crossing, riders appeared. Not Pike's lawmen this time, but townsfolk curious, alarmed at the sight of wagons strung together. One young man called out, "Where are you headed? To truth!" Martha shot back, not breaking stride. "If you've got courage, come along." Some peeled away, but others turned their horses to follow. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the caravan had doubled. Whispers spread faster than hooves. Gideon's farm was marching. Sela was leading, Pike's grip was trembling. They entered the square by noon. The courthouse loomed tall, its steps cold and gray under the winter sun. Judge Pike's flag still hung heavy over the doorway, bold as ever. But the sound of wheels and boots echoing through cobblestones made shutters creak open doors, unlatch. Townsfolk peered out, eyes wide at the sight, a procession led not by soldiers but by a woman with bandaged hands, a wounded cowboy at her side, and a boy carrying scraps like they were sacred. Sela climbed the steps, ledger pressed against her chest. The crowd hushed. Pike's deputies stood frozen at the corners, unsure whether to sneer or to retreat. Sela's voice cut the silence. 3 weeks from now, Judge Pike would call a tribunal. But lies cannot wait that long. Last night, men came with shovels to plant graves where none existed. Tonight, they'll try again, and tomorrow, worse. So we come now before the earth is sown with deceit. She opened the ledger. Pages fluttered in the breeze. The names glimmered like small flames. She read them aloud, one by one, voice steady, never faltering. With each name spoken, heads lifted in the crowd. Widow Gray, Samuel Brandt, the Harper brothers, Alton Briggs. When she finished, the square was silent, but charged. Then Briggs raised his cane high. "I sign with my life," he bellowed. His words cracked like thunder. Others echoed, "So do I." And our voices swelled, weaving into a roar. Pike's deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted, some clenched fists, but none advanced. Sela closed the ledger gently. "This is the first page," she told them. "Not the last. Each of you here, your names belong in it. If Pike's men burn barns, let your words rebuild stronger walls. If they plant bones, let your truth unearth them before they rot." The square erupted in applause, raw and uneven, but fierce. The courthouse itself seemed to tremble under it. Gideon leaned on his cane chest, heaving with pride. Martha pressed her lips tight, eyes glistening. Eli beamed, clutching his satchel like treasure. Somewhere behind shuttered windows, Judge Pike surely heard. And for the first time, perhaps, he felt the ground tilt beneath him. For a heartbeat after Sela closed the ledger, the town square held its breath, as if the air itself had to choose whose side it was on. Then shutters creaked wider. People spilled from doorways, and the murmur of 100 second thoughts turned into a single restless sound. Gideon shifted his weight to ease the pull in his bad leg. Martha stood shoulder to shoulder with Sela, bonnet strings, loose jaw set, like a woman who had decided that fear would have to find another house to live in. The courthouse doors banged open. 2 deputies strode out first, faces wearing the same bored cruelty they'd practiced for years. Behind them came Horace Pike in his robe, no wig, no pretense of humility, just black cloth and a gavel he didn't bother to hide. He paused midway down the steps to make the square his room, his gaze crawling the crowd until it landed on Sela, as if she were a stain he meant to scrub. What is this Pike-called voice, carrying like a bell that had forgotten how to ring anything but scorn but disorder, dressed in Sunday clothes? Processions, proclamations, a woman playing clerk on my steps. You confuse noise with law. Sela didn't move an inch. We confuse nothing, she answered. We witness. We write. We refuse to be erased. A ripple moved through the people. Some flinched at her boldness, others straightened because of it. Gideon's hand brushed the small of her back, steady, not steering. Martha took one step forward, enough to stand in the voice's path if Pike tried to swing it hard. Pike's smile was thin. I'll not have my court hijacked by theatrics. You want order? Wait 3 weeks. I'll judge your domestic fitness then. 3 weeks is time enough to bury lies, Sela said. Last night your men came with shovels. They meant to salt our ground with bones you chose. We came before the ground could be spoiled. A wave of noise rolled toward the steps. Outrage, disbelief, a few defiant laughs that sounded desperate. Pike skipped right over the accusation, as if refusing to look at the sun could unmake daylight. He raised the notice one of his men thrust at him and let it unroll with a flourish. Hear me, he proclaimed. By authority vested in me by Pike County and the territorial code, I advance the tribunal. 2 days hence. Here. He snapped his wrist and the parchment cracked like a whip. Further, I issue writ to seize contraband documents purporting to be legal instruments, his eyes cut to the ledger against Sela's chest for review and proper custody. Improper custody. Martha returned, voice like glass. That book is a citizen's petition. Protected. You'll seize it the day we seize your ledgers with the same courtesy warrants properly signed, witnesses present, chain of custody, unbroken. Some of the crowd blinked, words like chain of custody tasted new in their mouths. The deputies scowled, unused to statutes blocking muscle. Pike's gaze flicked to Martha's law books, as if he could set them ablaze with irritation alone. Ma'am, he said, sweet as spoiled milk, you are a widow in need of a cause. Don't choose the wrong one. Martha didn't blink. I chose truth years ago and married a man who kept receipts. A few men near the back chuckled quickly, strangled as if they were not yet ready to be seen laughing on the wrong team. Pike shifted tactics. You, he said, jabbing the gavel at Gideon. Hayes, you parade your charity as if it were honor. You owe fines. You owe decency. 2 days. Or we come collect what is ours. Gideon's voice was even as cold water. I owe nothing to a thief. Pike's face went a shade meaner. Deputies, he said softly. The ledger. The 2 men started down the steps, cautious, not because of Gideon's rifle, but because the square had changed shape since last month. Alton Briggs planted his cane at the foot of the stairs and didn't move. The Harper brothers drifted in front of the steps as if they were just stretching, and somehow their stretching took up an awful lot of space. Widow Gray. God bless her, stepped into the path and spilled a basket of bread with exaggerated clumsiness. Mercy, she cried, snatching loaves, blocking boots, apologizing so loudly that the men couldn't decide whether to shove her or help gather crumbs. Selah didn't bolt. She didn't need to. She lifted the ledger higher, let everyone see what the deputies were reaching for. You want it, she called. Take it in front of all these eyes. Show them what you seize from your neighbors, their names. It was a dare and a mirror at once. More faces turned souring as they saw the picture, big men taking paper from burned hands. One deputy wavered, then dropped his reach. Pike hissed a curse that only the first row could hear. From the crowd's far side, a man in a dark coat and collar moved through like someone parting grass. Reverend Collier, neutral as the courthouse flag, careful as a cat in a market. He mounted the lower step and lifted a hand. Friends, he said in the voice he used to quell babies and drunk men alike, we might keep the talk and leave the shoving. Judge Pike, let me suggest, if there is writing to be seen, let us see it. Let the signatures be read into the town's hearing. If it is false, the light will show it. If it is true, the light will show it. Selah's surprise lasted a heartbeat. Then she understood Collier was no ally, not yet, but he had staked his ministry on words witnessed. He was offering a pulpit the judge couldn't gag without losing his claim to daylight. Pike gritted his teeth. Fine, he snapped. Read your petition. Hang yourself with it. He looked to the Reverend. You'll keep order. I'll keep witness. Collier said, not bowing quite as low as expected. So Selah read again this time, with the pastor's voice keeping the square quiet, and Pike forced to stand and listen while neighbors' names piled like stones. When she reached the end, she didn't grandstand. She held the book steady and looked at the people instead of the judge. If you know truth, sign. If you don't, she said. But eat your own fear before you try to feed it to your children. A quiet amen came from someone who hadn't said the word in months. Then the line formed slow, at first, then with a shove of courage. Men who owned land put ink next to their names. Women who owned nothing but their own spines added their marks. When the storekeeper's boy stepped up and signed without looking toward his father's shop, Selah felt something ease that she hadn't known she'd been holding tight. Not everyone came. A few slipped back into doorways. A butcher shook his head and muttered about feeding a family. One of Pike's men laughed and mimed writing his name in the air, then drew a finger across his throat and grinned. Courage didn't win the square clean. It won it enough. By late afternoon, the deputies had stopped pretending to seize the ledger and started taking the names of those who signed. Martha watched their pencils as if she could snap the lead by staring. She drifted to the far edge of the circle and pressed a folded packet into a young rider's hand, Benson, the freckled courier who'd brought Pike's notice to the ranch. To the territorial marshal, she whispered, "Ride hard and take the long road." Benson swallowed and stuffed the packet into his vest as if it were a secret burning hole. "Yes, ma'am." He faded like a boy who had learned the trick from shadows. The winter sun leaned against the roofline. Collier cleared his throat. Friends, the daylight leaves us. Go home. Do not drink courage into foolishness. Gideon nodded and touched Sela's elbow. We leave with company, he said, and he didn't mean conversation. When they rolled out, 5 other wagons fell in with theirs without being asked. The Harper brothers rode flank rifles, slung but not hidden. Widow Gray clucked her horse with the hard-won calm of someone who has birthed children in storms. Pike didn't try to stop them. He stood on his step robe, black against the gray wood eyes, thin and bright. He let them see his smile, small, tight, certain as a knot. It said 2 days. The road home was colder than morning, the kind of cold that finds knuckles and faith. Twice they found brush dragged across the path, and twice the men cleared it without comment. Near the river crossing, somebody had slicked a patch of ice with water so a wagon might break an axle. The Harpers went first and sanded the grade with old grain. It held. Eli rode in the back of the wagon with the ledger on his lap, both hands on the boards, as if bracing a cradle. They looked scared, he whispered, meaning the deputies, meaning half the town. Sela tucked her shawl tighter around the book and the boy. Scared men do brave things sometimes, she said, and foolish ones. We'll be ready for both. At the ranch gate, a sheet of paper was nailed to the post, Pike's seal, the script neat and arrogant. Notice of tribunal. It read, 2 days hence. Presence required. Gideon Hayes Sela. There was no last name written Martha Calloway as witness. Failure to appear will be construed as confession by absence. Gideon tore it down and didn't bother to crumple it. He laid it flat on the table like a map they would have to cross, whether they liked the country or not. Sela set the ledger beside it and opened to a new page. The lamps burned low and long while they planned. Martha sorted her husband's papers into piles, deeds, transfers, receipts, the ugly math of theft. We'll need copies, she said. 3 of everything. 1 to speak, 1 to hold, 1 to bury where Pike can't find it if the worst comes. Gideon checked the rifle, then checked the buckets, then checked the roof for sparks that weren't there. Work steadied his breath. Eli, he said gently, sleep. Big men will stand outside tonight. Eli's jaw set. I'll stand inside, he bargained, with my eyes open. Done, Gideon said. And the boy squared his narrow shoulders as if he'd grown a year. Sela wrote headings on clean sheets in a hand the judge would have to respect even if he hated the fingers that made it testimony. Transfers, disappearances, sabotage, fire. Under each she listed names. She left space for the ones who would find courage in the next 48 hours. She left no space for the ones who would try to take it away. When the last lamp was doused, she stepped to the porch and breathed the night. The barn smelled of damp ash and the stubborn sweetness of hay that wouldn't quit. Somewhere a fox barked small and thin. On the post where the notice had been, the nail hole glinted like a tiny eye. 2 days. Pike would come dressed in law and armed with fear. They would come with pages and with people with names that had weight and faces that wouldn't turn away. Sela pressed both palms to the ledger's cover. The burn still hurt, but the pain had purpose now. We'll meet you in daylight, she said softly to the dark, whether to the judge, or to the town, or to the part of herself that had learned to stand she couldn't have said. Inside, Gideon rechecked the latch like a man blessing a threshold. Martha wrapped the fire hook in burlap and set it by the door. Eli curled on his pallet and left his boots on. The house went quiet, but it wasn't the quiet of surrender. It was the hush of breath before a line is spoken in a room that has run out of lies. The next dawn was blue with cold, a thin strip of light breaking the frost like a blade. Gideon rose first, though he hadn't truly slept. He sat at the table where the judge's notice still lay beside Sela's fresh pages. The words were stark against the wood like dueling commandments, one promising punishment, the other promising testimony. He ran a thumb along the edge of Pike's proclamation, then set his palm over Sela's notes. Sela stirred not long after. Her face carried the weight of a woman who had dreamed of flames even in sleep, though her voice was steady when she said, "We'll need more hands before we face him. Martha joined them, shawl-tight hair already pinned as if the trial had begun. "I sent for more than hands," she said. "The rider will reach the marshal by tonight if he doesn't break his horse." I copied the receipts, the deed transfers, every ugly page John kept. One bundle's in the courier's satchel now. That means even if Pike burns this house to the ground, the record won't die here. Gideon nodded once. It was a farmer's nod, spare and final. Then we braced the rest. Eli sat at the edge of the table, still small but refusing to look it. He reached for the ledger, laid his hand over Sela's, and said, "Tell me again what I say if they ask." "You say nothing unless I tell you," Sela said quickly. "You are a boy, Eli. They can twist boys' words." "But I saw them," he protested, eyes fierce. "I saw the men pour kerosene by the barn. I heard one call Pike's name." Gideon's gaze softened, though his tone was granite. "There's time for truth, son. But first there's time for living. Let us speak for you." Eli swallowed his pride, but his eyes smoldered as he nodded. By mid-morning, the yard filled with allies. The Harper brothers arrived with rifles across their saddles, their boots frosted from a long ride. Widow Gray came jaw-set, clutching her rosary, as if each bead were a bullet. Even Alton Briggs shuffled in, leaning heavy on his cane, but declaring with a grin, "If I can't swing a rifle, I can still swing my tongue, and mine cuts sharp as any blade." Sela felt the weight of it. People coming not for her alone, but for something larger than any one of them. It was hope, but also responsibility. She met Gideon's eyes. If Pike strikes, he strikes at all of them now. He already did. Gideon answered. We just finally stood close enough to feel it together. They spent the day preparing. Martha trained the younger men on how to handle documents in court. Don't let the judge take them without 2 witnesses. If he tears a page, call it out loud. Every hand here must act like a scribe's. She had them repeat the steps until even the Harper brothers' men, more used to saddles than statutes, could chant the rules like catechism. Selah practiced her testimony aloud, voice low but firm. "My name is Selah. I was sold into chains by decree of this very judge. I was freed not by his mercy but by neighbors who risked standing against his word. I have worked this land. I have signed my name. I will not be erased again." Each time she spoke it, her chest tightened, but each time it loosened quicker too. Gideon listened, correcting her posture, reminding her to breathe when anger threatened to fray her sentences. By late afternoon, a scout galloped in Benson, the courier's younger brother sent back with word. "Marshal's on his way," he panted, sliding off the horse. "He'll ride by moon if he must. Says he's heard of Pike before. Says he wants to see if the rumors wear flesh." Hope surged, but Gideon kept his tone measured. 2 days is little time for a marshal to catch breath. Don't count on miracles. Night fell heavy and silent. Stars burned hard against the black sky. They kept the lamps low and the rifles close. The cold crept deep into the bones, but it didn't silence the murmur of prayers, of whispered strategies, of the creak of wood as people turned restlessly on their pallets. Sometime past midnight, a sound broke the fragile stillness, a whistle high and sharp from the tree line. The men rose instantly, rifles in hand. Gideon raised a hand for silence, then whistled back once low. A figure stepped from the shadows. One of the Harper cousins, face pale with fear. "They're moving," he hissed. "I saw torchlight by the creek, 12 men at least. They mean to scare us down before court." Martha drew herself taller. "Then let them waste their fire on water. We don't bend to fear." Gideon scanned the yard. "Spread the guards. Keep the women and children inside." "Selah, I'm staying," she interrupted, voice sharp. "If they come for me, I'll meet them on my own ground." He didn't argue. He knew by now she could not be moved by anything but her own choice. They waited, breath fogging the air, every creak of the barn timbers a gunshot in the silence. The torchlight bobbed closer, then halted at the ridge. Shouts echoed, angry mocking the kind meant to unnerve. A bottle arced through the dark and shattered near the fence, flames licking the ground until snow smothered them. But the men didn't advance further. Perhaps it was the sight of so many rifles glinting in the moonlight, or perhaps the fear that their judge's robe wouldn't protect them in the dark. After a tense half-hour, the torchlight dwindled, the voices receded, and the night settled once more into bitter silence. Selah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "They test us," she whispered. "They measure," Gideon corrected. Tomorrow, they'll strike harder. But tonight they learned we don't break easy. Inside, Eli had not slept a wink. When Selah came in, he threw his arms around her waist and held tight. She bent, kissed his hair, and murmured, "Not long now, Eli. Just hold with me. Just 2 more suns." The boy didn't answer, but his small body clung to her as if she were the last solid thing in a shifting world. Outside the nail hole where Pike's notice had been hammered still glinted in the moonlight. Gideon stared at it, jaw tight. It wasn't just a hole in wood anymore. It was a promise, a challenge, a clock counting down to the tribunal. And as the wind howled across the plain, carrying the scent of smoke and fear, every soul inside that house knew 2 days would decide everything. The day before the tribunal dawned brittle and bright, the kind of winter morning that made sound carry farther than reason. Frost silvered the split-rail fence. Thin steam wafted from the stock's nostrils like prayer. Gideon woke on the chair he hadn't meant to sleep in, leg throbbing a slow drumbeat under the blanket. Across the room, Selah sat at the table shawl, pulled close, lips moving as she read lines she had written in the night. When she reached the end, she didn't put the pencil down. She sharpened it. He watched her for a heartbeat, the bandaged hands, the steady jaw, and something in him loosened and tightened at once. "You'll wear the lead to a nub," he said. She glanced up, a sliver of amusement flickering through the fatigue. "Better the lead than our nerve." Martha arrived with the light bonnet askew from riding hard, a packet of folded papers cinched with twine. "I made 3 sets," she said, dropping them on the table like ammunition. "Transfers, receipts, names with dates. 1 bundle goes to Collier to hold in the church, 1 to the marshal when he arrives, and 1 stays here. If Pike burns his way through all 3, then he's fighting angels, not us." "Marshal's still coming?" Gideon asked. "Benson says he crossed the river at midnight," Martha replied. "He won't make noon tomorrow, but he'll make the day after, which means our best protection in court is not his badge." She tapped Selah's notes. "It's your voice." Eli hovered, hair sticking up like a thistle. "What about my voice?" Selah softened her tone. "You save it. If they press you, speak only what you saw with your own eyes. No guesses." "I don't guess," he said, stung. "I know," she said gently. "That's why I'm saving you, for when truth needs a boy to carry it." He squared his shoulders at that and nodded once, swallowing pride and the want to be big all in one motion. By mid-morning, the yard filled again, neighbors, some bold, some sheepish, all carrying something: planks, eggs, a jar of salve, a name. Widow Gray stood at the porch steps as if it were a communion rail, pressing rosary beads into rough palms and saying, "You come back from court the way you leave heads up." The Harper brothers checked rifle sights and then, under Martha's curt tutelage, practiced saying "objection" without sounding like men asking to borrow a cup of sugar. Reverend Collier came walking with his collar snug and his face careful. He took the duplicate bundle from Martha with 2 fingers and a nod. "The church safe has held money and bread," he said. "It can hold receipts." His eyes found Selah and held a second too long. "I'll post a deacon at the door. We'll let no one say God loses paperwork." Selah lifted the ledger. "Read 2 pages into your sermon Sunday," she said. "Not as gospel, as record." Collier's mouth twitched at the corners. "There will be those who say I've turned my pulpit into a printing press." "Maybe the press needs a pulpit," Selah answered. He bowed his head, whether to her or to Providence, and left with the packet tucked under his coat like a newborn. Near noon, a messenger rode up with a white cloth tied to a stick, old sign for parley. It was Deputy Calder, the first one they'd met in those early days when Selah still smelled of shackles and of hope she didn't trust. He swung down, slow hands spread to show he carried no rifle. Selah felt Gideon's muscles go taut beside her. Calder tipped his hat to the space between them. "Judge sent me with a settlement," he said, weighing the word like it might bite him. "You bring the girl to the steps at dusk, you withdraw the petition, you take your fine reduced to half. He'll let you keep your house." No tribunal. Silence held. Then Gideon said what the wind itself might have said if it had a mouth. "No." Calder's jaw ticked. "Hayes be a realist. He's the law. Tomorrow he'll be more of it. You put that woman on those steps and he will make spect." He cut the word short, changed it. "Example. Of you both." Selah spoke before Gideon could. "He already did," she said. "And here we stand. She took one step closer until Calder had to look her in the eye. "Tell your judge the price for my freedom isn't my life. It's his power." Calder's gaze skittered and settled. For an instant, something like shame passed small and scared. Then duty, or the habit of it, covered his face again. "Dusk," he said. "Or we see you in irons tomorrow." "Tell him to polish them," Gideon replied. "We're bringing witnesses." Calder gathered his reins and rode off without looking back. They ate on their feet, cold bread, hot coffee, the last of the stew stretched with more water and pepper than anyone admitted. Gideon limped fence with the Harper brothers, pointing out where wire could be reset to slow a mounted rush. Martha drilled Widow Gray and the Harpers on chain of custody until the phrases lost their edges and became songs they couldn't stop humming. Eli sat at the table with Selah and copied names onto small slips, one to carry in a pocket, one to leave at the church, one to tuck under a loose board by the hearth. "We hide truth in pairs," Selah told him. "So if one is stolen, it leaves a twin to testify." He paused, chewed the pencil. "What if they take both?" "Then we use our mouths," she said simply. By late afternoon, a thin snow began, the kind that can't decide whether it's meant for beauty or for trouble. It dusted the char along the barn wall and laced Widow Gray's shawl with white. The men set extra buckets by the doors. Selah tucked a decoy ledger, blank pages weighted to feel right on the mantel, and slid the real one into a flour sack under the false bottom Martha had hammered into the bin that morning. 3 places, Martha said, wrapping the wood. "He'll find one and brag. He won't think to look for honest food hiding a meal of truth," smart Gideon said. Hungry Martha corrected. Twilight brought a new kind of quiet, thick and watchful. The Harper brothers took the north and south paths. Gideon sat just inside the door with the rifle across his knees and the fire hook within reach. Eli perched under the window, eyes rimmed with determination and sleep. Selah moved through the house without wasted motion, closing shutters but not latching them, leaving a seam of invitation where a thief might slip a hand and think himself clever. She didn't have to wait long. A shadow unstitched from the yard and slid along the porch. There was a pause, the kind men take before they sin. Then the shutter tipped and a hand with a scar across the knuckles edged in testing. Selah met Gideon's eyes. He nodded once. She lifted the latch, not to welcome, but to spring what she'd set. The intruder spilled into the room in a crouch, head low, eyes on the mantel where the decoy ledger sat like bait. He snatched it, tucked it under his coat, and turned and found Gideon's rifle a breath away, and Selah blocking the door with her body like a wall that had learned to be a woman. He froze. In the hearth light, the mole by his right eye showed plain, and his boots told on him, heel nicked in a neat crescent. The saboteur's print from the fence, the well, the bucket, the barn. "You," Gideon said, almost gently. "Name." The man's jaw flexed. "Mark Rudd," he spat. "Deputy," Deputy Selah repeated as if tasting rotten fruit. "You carry the judge's color at noon and his fire at midnight." Rudd shrugged, pretending bravado while his eyes hunted the room for a rabbit's hole. "Judge says the book's poison. Says folks will drink it till the town dies." Selah took one step closer, and the deputy, a foot taller, stepped back. "He says truth is poison because it burns his throat," she said. We all swallow hard. Outside, a whip of wind flung the door wide, and Martha's shadow filled the frame with a Harper brothers rifle behind her like a second spine. Rudd shifted wrong. Gideon cocked the hammer. The room tightened. "No blood." Selah said, voice low and absolute. "We don't give him a corpse to parade. We give him a thief we caught stealing paper." Rudd's lip curled. "You won't take me to jail." "We'll take you to the square," Gideon said. "We'll let Collier write your name in his book next to the word thief, and we'll let you go. Then tomorrow you can testify how you came for words and found witnesses instead of fear." Rudd's breath hitched. His hand twitched toward the ledger under his coat, as if he could make it disappear by wanting it. Selah reached and plucked it free, calm as a mother reclaiming a knife from a child. "It's blank," she said softly, almost pitying. "You risked your soul for a book with no story." She put it back on the mantel and set a lamp next to it so it shone like a joke. Rudd's face flushed up from his collar. Gideon stepped aside just enough to open a path to the door. "Go," he said. "Tell your judge we keep the real words where fire can't drink them." Rudd hesitated, calculating whether a retreat could be called a strategy when his friends asked. Then he bolted boots, striking the porch with the same heel nick that had haunted their nights. Martha moved so he had to brush past her shoulder, the smallest humiliation, the kind that sours a liar's stomach. They watched him run into the snow until the dark swallowed him. Selah shut the door, slid the latch, and only then exhaled. Eli scrambled up from his post, all nerves and righteousness. "We should have tied him," he blurted. "Made him stand before everybody tonight." Gideon sank back onto the chair and rubbed a hand over his face. "Tying a man is a thing that unravels faster than you think," he said. "Tomorrow we'll knot him with something stronger," Papercella said. Witness Martha added. They ate a second supper because fear had left room in their bellies for cornbread and coffee, and a handful of dried apples that tasted better than harvest. Selah replaced the decoy ledger with another, then checked the real one, palmed a pinch of flour, and dusted the lid so it would fall right when she set it back. She wrote a new line on the fresh page. Intruder Deputy Mark Rudmole, right eye, heel nick matches prints. Stole decoy ledger. Witnesses G.M.E. let go unharmed to testify by mouth. Gideon watched her script while the fire ticked. "Tomorrow," he said, not a question. "Tomorrow," she echoed. They lay down without undressing, boots near the bed, shawls doubled. The house settled wood talking to itself. Outside, the snow slowed to a sift, quieting the night into something almost gentle. Selah stared at the dark until her eyes made patterns where none were, then closed them on purpose, and pictured the courthouse steps in daylight, the faces, the flags, the book in her hands with names that would not be erased. In the thin hour before dawn, the rooster tested the morning. Gideon touched the latch and felt the cold of it travel up his arm. Eli stirred and sat up, hair wild and eyes clear. Martha already had the kettle on flame, catching like relief. They did not speak bravado. They didn't need to. They dressed for weather and for war, gathered papers, and courage strapped hope across their backs like tools. When the wagon rolled, the snow squeaked under the iron rims. The sky wore a hard blue along the east. The road to town looked the same as every other day. It had never meant more. The wagon creaked like an old hymn as it rolled toward the town, its wheels crunching over crusted snow. Each sound echoed too loud in Gideon's ears, like the world had decided to shout their arrival before they reached it. He sat stiff on the bench, one hand resting over his rifle, though it was tucked beneath the canvas. His leg throbbed under the blanket, a steady pulse that kept time with the horse's steps. Beside him, Selah sat with her shawl pulled tight, eyes straight ahead, her jaw firm enough to crack stone. The ledger wrapped in a flour sack rested in her lap, as if it were a child she meant to protect with her last breath. Eli perched in the back. His shoulders squared his lips, moving without sound, rehearsing words or maybe prayers. Martha rode beside them on her own mare, back straight, papers tucked in her satchel, like a general's dispatches. Every so often she glanced at the wagon and gave Selah a small nod, the kind that meant more than speeches. We go together. The road to town cut through barren fields where stubble poked through snow like broken bones. A hawk circled overhead, screeched sharp enough to make Eli flinch. The boy gripped the sideboard. Feels like they all know, he whispered. They do, Gideon said, voice rough. And let them. Better a storm seen than one hiding. As they neared the outskirts, the silence broke. Farmers stood at their fences, leaning on rails, watching the wagon pass. Some nodded, some turned away. A woman lifted her baby so he could see. An old man spat into the snow and muttered. Whispers carried, "That's her. That's the girl. The judge won't stand for it. Hayes is mad, brave, foolish." Right. By the time they reached the square, a crowd had gathered, spilling down the courthouse steps like floodwater. Men in hats pulled low, women clutching shawls, children half hidden behind skirts, but peeking out with wide eyes. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, a hive stirred and waiting. The courthouse doors swung open, and Judge Pike strode out with 2 deputies at his flanks. His coat was blacker than tar, his hat brim wide enough to shadow his eyes, though his smirk showed plain. "Well," he drawled, voice carrying across the square, if it isn't the hero of lost causes. And the lady who thinks ink can wash away iron. He gestured with a lazy hand. Bring them up. The deputies stepped forward, but Gideon lifted a hand. We walk, he said. Climbing down slow, his legs stiff but unbending. He helped Selah down as if she were porcelain and granite all at once. Martha dismounted, looped her mare's reins, and pressed the satchel to her chest. Eli scrambled down, last chin high, despite his shaking knees. The crowd parted as they climbed the steps, murmurs rippling like wind in dry grass. At the top, Pike spread his arms wide. Welcome to justice, he said with mock grandeur. Where truth is what I say it is, Selah's voice cut sharp, clear as the frost. Not today, the words hung. A few gasps, a cough. Pike's smile faltered for a beat, then twisted. Ah, the chained girl speaks. And what does she bring? Tales scribbled in the dark, accusations without proof. You should know, little one, that paper burns fast. Selah unwrapped the flour sack, revealing the ledger. She held it aloft so the sun glinted off its worn leather cover. Then let's read before you set your fire. A murmur surged through the crowd. Pike's hand twitched, but he didn't snatch it. He gestured instead. Proceed. Amuse us. Martha stepped forward, voice brisk, commanding. We present receipts signed witnessed, records of payments demanded beyond law, names of families driven from homes, crops seized, fines invented. She pulled pages from her satchel, held them high, then handed one to Reverend Collier, who stood near the front. This copy belongs to the people. Collier's deep voice carried as he read aloud. Receipt for 3 barrels of grain seized from the Harper family. No record of return. No justification under statute. His tone was solemn, like scripture. The crowd stirred. The Harpers themselves stepped forward, nodding grim confirmation. Pike's smile thinned. Circumstance. Misunderstanding. A judge's duty requires Selah cut him off. A judge's duty requires fairness. You demanded bribes from freedmen. You sold children like cattle. You ordered lashes without trial. Her voice did not waver. We wrote it all. The crowd erupted shouts, cries, fists in the air. Pike raised his hands, barking, silence, but his command cracked. It no longer rang absolute. Deputy Rudd, the same who had tried to steal the decoy ledger, shifted uneasily at Pike's side. His mole by the eye glistened with sweat. He caught Selah's gaze and looked away. Eli spoke then clear and fierce. I saw him take the bucket from our well. I saw the prints match his boot, and I saw Selah write it down. The boy's voice cracked, but the truth in it silenced the crowd more than Pike's shout had. Martha added, sharp as a hammer. 3 copies. One with Collier, one with the marshal arriving today. Burn this one and truth still breathes. Pike's mask slipped. Rage twisted his face. Enough! He stepped toward Selah, but Gideon planted himself between them, rifle slung but ready. The crowd surged forward, not to attack but to shield their presence, a wall Pike could not ignore. From the street came the thunder of hooves, all eyes turned. A rider galloped in coat, flapping badge, glinting Marshal Benson dust-caked and hard-eyed. He reined up at the steps, voice booming. Court is mine now. The square roared, relief and fury tangled. Pike froze, caught between the crowd's fire and the marshal's authority. Selah held the ledger high once more, her voice steady, carrying above the tumult. This is the record. These are the names. And this is the day truth stopped hiding. The people cheered loud and long, their voices shaking the windows. Pike's smirk vanished. For the first time, he looked small. Gideon touched Selah's arm, his voice rough but certain. It's starting. She nodded, eyes on the horizon, knowing the fight was far from done. But for the first time, hope stood taller than fear. The marshal's horse still snorted steam into the cold morning air when silence fell over the courthouse square. Marshal Benson sat tall in the saddle, his hat brim low, a pair of revolvers heavy on his hips. His voice, though, even carried weight that cut through the noise like an axe. This tribunal falls under federal jurisdiction until further notice. All evidence will be reviewed under my authority. The crowd shifted, some gasping, others cheering. Pike stiffened as though a rope had been drawn taut around his neck. His lips peeled back in a forced smile. Marshal Benson, he said, dripping venom under honey. An unexpected pleasure. You ride in on rumor, and suddenly this backwater square is your gallows. Benson swung off his horse boots, thudding on the steps. I ride in on reports of unlawful seizure, intimidation, and abuse of power. He scanned the gathered crowd eyes, sharp as glass, and I see I wasn't misled. His gaze landed on Sela on the ledger in her arms. You the one who kept record? Her voice didn't falter. I am. Every lash, every theft, every name. She held it up again. And 3 copies spread beyond your reach. That last sentence wasn't for the marshal, it was for Pike. His jaw twitched. His deputies shifted behind him, uncertainty replacing bravado. Rudd in particular looked ready to melt into the boards of the porch. Pike tried to laugh, though it came jagged. This girl, this chained scrap, you'd take her word over mine, over the seal of this bench. Benson turned to the crowd. How many here can speak to the judge's fairness? The answer came like thunder. Voices shouted at once, calling names of loved ones, fined lands, stripped sons, whipped. Widow Gray lifted her rosary, crying, He bled my Samuel in that jail and never gave cause. The Harpers raised fists. Briggs leaned on his cane and hollered, He near starved my stock for a bribe I never owed. The square pulsed with rage until it felt the boards beneath their feet might shatter. Benson raised his hand. Order. The noise softened but did not vanish. He turned back to Pike. That ledger will be reviewed. You will stand inquiry. Until then, you are relieved of duty. Pike's face blazed scarlet. He barked, You dare strip me here in my own town. He turned to his deputies. Arrest him. But the deputies hesitated. Rudd stepped back. The others shifted gaze, falling to the ground. No one moved. The silence condemned Pike louder than any noose. Sela's breath came fast. She whispered to Gideon, He's cornered. Gideon's reply was low, certain. Cornered men bite hardest. And bite Pike did. In a flash, he drew a pistol from beneath his coat, not at the marshal, but at Sela. The crowd screamed. Gideon surged forward, shoving Sela back with one arm, even as his other reached for his rifle. The crack of a gunshot split the air. Time seemed to slow. Sela stumbled, clutching the ledger tight against her chest. Gideon roared, firing back. The crowd surged, screams and curses tangled. When the smoke cleared, Pike stood with his pistol still raised, but his shot had gone wide, burying itself in the courthouse column. Gideon's bullet had struck true, tearing the wood from the steps an inch from Pike's boots. Marshal Benson's revolver, however, pressed cold and certain at Pike's temple. Drop it, Benson growled. For the first time, Pike's hand shook. The pistol clattered to the boards. The marshal kicked it away. The crowd erupted not in panic now, but in release. Cheers and sobs crashed together. Men grabbed one another's shoulders. Women lifted children high, shouting, Look! Look with your own eyes! Justice breathes. Sela stood frozen, heart hammering. She looked down at the ledger. Pike's bullet had grazed its leather cover, tearing the corner. But the words inside every mark she'd carved remained untouched. She pressed it to her chest, tears burning her eyes. Benson seized Pike by the arm, twisting it behind his back. By order of federal law, you are under arrest. He snapped cuffs around the judge's wrists. The crowd roared approval, fists pumping boots, stamping the boards. Gideon, chest heaving, looked to Sela. You all right? She nodded, voice thick. He aimed to silence me. And still I speak. The marshal turned to her, nodding once with respect. You may have just saved this county, ma'am. Your pen may weigh more than any gun here. The people surged forward, surrounding Sela, Gideon, Eli, and Martha, not to harm, but to shield, to lift. Hands reached out, not to bind, but to touch in thanks. Someone shouted, Her words kept us alive. Another cried, No more chains. Eli clutched Sela's hand and whispered fiercely, We won, didn't we? Sela bent low, whispering back through her tears. We started Eli. That's enough for today. Gideon's arms circled them both, his voice steady as the square shook with victory. Tomorrow, we build what he tried to burn. And in the distance, the courthouse bell tolled noon, not for Pike's judgment, but for theirs, the people's announcing a new hour. None thought they'd live to see. The courthouse bell still echoed over the rooftops when Pike was dragged down the steps, shackled and stumbling. The same stairs he had once descended with arrogance now struck under his boots like hammers, each clang of the cuffs answering the bell above. The crowd parted not with fear but with a grim kind of triumph, the way townsfolk step aside when winter finally cracks and the river begins to move again. Marshal Benson kept a firm hand on Pike's shoulder, his face carved in stone. "You'll stand trial," he said low but loud enough for the square to hear. "Not by your rules, not by your cronies, by law. The kind you spit on." Pike twisted, spitting on the boards. "Law bends to power, Marshal. Always has, always will." Sela stepped forward, clutching the ledger to her chest. Her voice cut the air like a blade. "Not today. Not anymore." The hush that fell was deeper than any silence they had known. Her words struck with the finality of a hammer on iron sealing what could not be undone. Martha moved beside her, unfastening the satchel at her shoulder. She withdrew her second bundle of copies, crisp pages bound with twine, and held them aloft. "These go to the press," she declared. "Every name, every theft, every bribe. No man or woman in this county will say they did not know." The crowd's roar swelled until the windows of the courthouse rattled. Even the deputies, once Pike's shadow, shifted closer to the marshal, as if stepping over an unseen line. Rudd sweat shining on his temple finally spoke. "I'll testify," he stammered. "I carried his orders, his false writs. I'll speak it plain." Benson gave a single nod. "And you'll do so under oath." Sela's knees trembled, but Gideon steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "You stood taller than all of us today," he murmured. She turned her face up to him, tears bright but her jaw unbroken. "I only wrote what I saw. The rest was you." Eli tugged her sleeve, whispering fierce as ever. "No, Sela, the rest was us." He gestured to the sea of townsfolk whose eyes now burned with something different than fear. Together they moved as one through the square, through the crowd, a river carrying them forward. No longer whispers, but voices shouted her name, shouted Gideon's, shouted for truth. Some wept openly, clutching neighbors, as if realizing for the first time they were not alone in their suffering. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, Pike was locked in the marshal's custody, bound for a federal cell. The crowd thinned, but the fire did not. Families lingered at the steps as though reluctant to let the moment end. They pressed food into Sela's hands, offered blankets for Gideon's leg, clasped Martha's arms with gratitude. Reverend Collier raised his Bible voice rough with emotion. "This day we mark the chains broken not by iron, but by courage. Let it be written that the people stood. And written it was first in Sela's ledger, then in Martha's copies, then in the voices of every man, woman, and child who had seen the judge fall." That night, by firelight in Gideon's cabin, the four of them sat together, Gideon's legs stretched out before him, pain dulled by Martha's poultice. Eli dozed at his side, head pillowed on Sela's lap. The ledger lay open between them, the ink stark, the pages still breathing. Sela traced one line with her finger, then closed the cover. He tried to burn it, and failed, Gideon said. She looked to him, her eyes fierce and soft all at once. "Then tomorrow we write more. Not of what he did, but what comes after." Gideon's smile was weary but real. "Then tomorrow we start again." The wind outside rattled the shutters, but it no longer sounded like chains. It sounded like freedom knocking. And the people of that county who once bowed their heads in silence now lifted them to the horizon, ready to speak, to build, to stand. The story did not end with Pike's cuffs nor with Sela's ink. It lived in every voice that dared to say aloud, "Not today. Not anymore." Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.